Chapter 11, The Crazy and the Mad, Uff. Let's call it a day. Nautilus watched as the last ruined kobold vanished into polygons, and nodded. Labyrinth mobs were so much harder to kill than the ones outside that it wasn't even funny. Panting, the ash-brown-haired teen sheathed his blade with a familiarity no 16-year-old should have. Brushing the strands of hair falling over his forehead, Nautilus was once again glad Kaiba hadn't coded sweat into the game. Are you okay, Naut? That last kobold got you good. Yeah, I'm all right, Yun. It got my arms numb for a while, but I didn't actually take much damage. Thanks to Liz's cyan scale bracers. While saying that, Nautilus touched said piece of armor. Liz's newest creation, after many, many tries. The party was all wearing different variations of the cyan scale armor series, all created using the cyan rock fish scales they brought her a few days ago as the base material. Nautilus had greaves, chestplate, and bracers, which suited his position as the frontliner. Drifter, on the other hand, had foregone the bulkier chestplate, since it would slow him down. Even Yuna was using some cyan scale-like bracers, after much insistence from her party members. All in all, there had been an overall increase in survivability for all of them. Raising his head, Nautilus snuck a glance at the men walking beside him. Drifter had just turned 20 a few months back, he had gathered from their conversations. Speaking about the real world was quickly becoming taboo amongst SAO players, but some things still slipped through from time to time. Anyway, Drifter was 20, not even 4 full years older than him. But the young man felt much more mature than him. Maybe it was because Drifter had already stepped into society while he was just a high schooler, and a sheltered one on top of that. Nautilus knew he had a problem. He wasn't just shy. There was a time in his youth when he actually couldn't talk with people other than his parents. He would open his mouth, but no sound would come out. It was only when he met Yuna, his cute, cheerful, beloved childhood friend that he got better. Unfortunately, his disease, his defect, wasn't cured. And it transferred over to SAO along with him. He stole a glance at Yuna, who noticed and blinked at him. They still hadn't told Drifter about the incident. They would have to soon. The change in difficulty from the outside to the labyrinth showed him that SAO would only get more dangerous as they advanced. And his problem could prove deadly, not just for him, but for his entire party. He looked over his shoulder to the older men, whose gaze seemed lost in the horizon. Yes, Drifter would have to know. Just. Not right now, a look. A sigh. Another look. Yuna had known Nautilus for long enough to understand he was overthinking again. It was a problem her childhood friend always had. Because of that situation, he tended to always think the worst. She didn't like that part of him. It wasn't like Yuna didn't understand why people were sometimes, or all the time, pessimistic. Life wasn't easy. But she still didn't like it. She preferred to view the world from a more positive perspective. Yuna had grown sheltered. Too sheltered, in fact. Since young, she had been taught by the best tutors, learned everything a rich young lady needed to know. And nothing else. Others might envy her because she lived a perfect life, but to Yuna, she just wanted to feel free. That was why she had begged her parents over and over again to play SAO. They were good parents, if a little stern, and knew that of everything she had been forced to learn, Yuna only enjoyed music. So they eventually relented, and allowed her to buy a nerve gear, but not before placing a lot of restrictions. Of course, none of them imagined what Kaiba was going to pull, otherwise they wouldn't have let her approach the helmet even if she was wearing a hazmat suit. She glanced at Drifter, the first one to hear her music other than Nautilus and her parents. Her first fan. Her new friend. He tried to hide it, but Yuna saw the pain inside of him. Emotion was indispensable to true music, and so Yuna had learned to see it in herself, and in others. Drifter blamed himself for the death of the girl he had told them about the day they met. It was drawing on his suffering that she had composed Rest. It was meant to comfort him. Instead, SAO transformed it into a skill. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. Drifter felt responsible for them. Nautilus and her. She had been curious about why that was so. A few days ago, Yuna had asked the info broker, Argo the Rat, about Drifter, and now she understood. Drifter didn't just lose the first player he met in SAO, but he also saw another commit suicide in front of him, and in neither of the cases he could do anything to help. So when he partied with them, Drifter probably started to feel like he had to protect Nautilus and Yuna. Like it was his responsibility. She wanted to tell him that wasn't the case, but she also liked having him around. And she knew even if she confronted him now, it would change nothing. After fighting together for so many days, they had started to care for each other. So she would just have to show him that she was capable of protecting him just as much as he protected her. Yuna and Nautilus were behaving weirdly today. They tried to be sneaky about it, but Drifter caught them stealing glances at him more than once during their journey back to Talbana. He was curious as to why, but he trusted they would tell him if it was something he should know. He looked at the date on his HUD. Today marked 20 days since they were imprisoned in SAO, and they were still stuck on the first floor of Aincrad. At this rhythm, they would never get out. He had a meeting with Argo later tonight to discuss the situation. Something needed to change. The info broker had come to Talbana a few days ago, saying that she wanted to be closer to the biggest source of information there was. He wasn't sure if she meant the labyrinth or the players. Maybe both. Either way, he welcomed her with open arms. He liked just sitting down and chatting away with her. Even the way they made each other pay for inconsequential and frankly useless intel had become a sort of game between them. One that Drifter was losing miserably, he would admit. Yuna had already pointed out that Argo behaved differently around him than she did with others. Drifter had already seen the info broker working more than once. He even helped her intimidate a player who refused to pay for the information he brought. While cheeky and full of sassy responses, Argo could also be very intimidating, and surprisingly scary considering she was shorter than Drifter's shoulders. But when somebody showed you their claws and made a passing remark about your precious bits, their size didn't really matter, did it? Argo's and Drifter's interactions were different. Not of the romantic kind, he had already made that very clear to Yuna and Nautilus, but more akin to that of a big brother and his little sister. They clicked well together, and understood each other. Drifter saw the weight the girl carried on her shoulders, a beta tester who knew much about the game's early stages, and yet couldn't stop hundreds of players from dying. And Argo saw in him a kindred spirit, who wanted to protect those close to him. And that included her. Yuna, Nautilus, and Drifter were acting strangely today, Liz thought. Well, Nautilus was never one for words, but Yuna and Drifter were usually quite chatty, but not on this occasion. They all seemed to be locked in their inner thoughts. Maybe something happened during their grinding session. She was happy to see that her crafts were holding on, though. Liz felt attached to the small party. Now she had a full line before her stall almost every day, but they were her first clients, the first ones to trust her. Even if Drifter worded it as if he was taking advantage of her, she knew he always intended to help. Maybe not for some grand, honorable motivation, but just because she was the first blacksmith he saw. Still, it didn't change the fact that she owed a large part of her recent success to him and his party. Thinking of that, she had another rather faithful and early client who she hadn't seen in a while. That one put quite strange orders in, even quirkier than Drifter's. Liz would have to introduce them to each other sometime. She had the feeling they would get along. The sounds of weapons clashing came from deep inside the labyrinth. A slim hooded figure drew her rapier back, and sidestepped the axe of the ruined kobold that was attacking her. Jumping nimbly over a second mob, she turned in midair, and, with her weapon glowing green, unleashed a flurry of blows on the third and fourth monsters. Even as they shattered, she was already dodging a fifth mob. Unfortunately for the player, kobolds always came in multiples of 3. The sixth ruined kobold hit her like a truck. She was barely able to place her rapier between herself and the incoming axe to cushion some of the force behind the blow, but was still sent flying. Her health dipped into the yellow zone. Swaying, the player got up and tightened her grip on the handle of her slim sword. The remaining 4 ruined kobolds were encircling her, and she had her back against the wall. Literally. So this was how she died. Terrible, but expected. She should never have been here anyway. She could accomplish nothing, not in SAO, and not in real life. She was worthless. That didn't mean she was going down without a fight. As the kobolds roared and charged at her, she lifted her rapier in a well-practiced stance, holding it at chest height, right arm pulled back as far as it could go. Just as she was about to activate the skill, the ruined kobold burst into pixels. Under her hood, the player blinked at the spot her enemy had just been in. The only evidence it ever existed were the vanishing shards in the air, and the murder weapon, what looked like a really long and sharp nail, thumping on the ground. Don't just stand there. Fight. She raised her gaze to see another player running towards her. The newcomer had black hair and eyes, was wearing little armor, and seemed very annoyed at her lack of action. Held in between their fingers were 3 other nails just like the one that killed the ruined kobold. Even as she watched, the player waved their hand and threw the weapons, nailing. The pun came to her mind even as she cringed, each of the other kobolds in the back of the head. Using the opening, the hooded girl stabbed multiple times with her rapier, killing 2 of the mobs whose health had already reached the red. She narrowly avoided the axe of the third and last one, and watched as her helper approached and stabbed it deeply in the left flank, slaying the final ruined kobold. "How are you?" She gazed at the other player from under her hood. It was another girl, and now that she was closer, she spotted several nails on her body. Why someone would need so many, she had no idea. But, well, they seemed useful. Without saying a word, she sheathed her rapier and walked past the other player. Her fingers idly opened her inventory, and she scowled. She was out of health potions. Just as well. It would be a waste to use them on her anyway. When she rescued the other girl, and she knew it was a girl beneath the cloak and hood, she wasn't expecting much. She just saw someone in danger, and came to help. She didn't need a reward or anything like that. But a thank you would have been nice. Instead, the girl didn't say a single word during the entire encounter. She just pushed past her, and walked deeper into the labyrinth. Deeper. For God's sake, her health was still in the yellow. Did she want to die? No sooner than that thought came to her mind, she froze. That was exactly it. The other girl didn't want to live anymore. There was no other reason why someone would almost die fighting two ruined kobold patrols at once, than head deeper into the labyrinth without healing. The hooded girl had a death wish. Frowning, she watched the departing figure. If the other player wanted to die, there was nothing she could do. But she couldn't bring herself to leave, not like that. Not when she knew someone was about to forfeit their life. And it was just as well that she didn't go, because she saw the girl collapse for no apparent reason. Struggling internally for all of half a second, she cursed and ran. For fuck's sake. She rushed towards the fallen girl, and grabbed her. Pushing the hood back to get a better look, she paused. She was beautiful. Long chestnut hair, and hazel eyes which were, at the moment, struggling to stay open. Shaking herself out of her brief stunned state at the appearance of the girl, she took out a health potion and forced her patient to drink it. Only when she saw the girl's health rise back to green that she let out a sigh of relief. When the girl finally came back to her senses, they stared at each other for a while. She had the feeling those hazel eyes would be strikingly clear and warm during normal times, but now they were clouded. She recognized the emotions hidden deep inside them too well. She had felt the same once. Still did sometimes. This was why when the girl tried to get up and walk away again, still silently, she grabbed her arm. "No you don't, miss. I didn't make you drink that potion so you could go off and die somewhere. I couldn't care less before, but if I let you go now, I will feel responsible for the rest of my days. You are coming to Talbana with me, and we are gonna have a talk. Got it?" It was not a question. If she needed to, she would carry the girl to the city. Luckily it didn't seem like that would be necessary. After a brief struggle, the previously hooded girl nodded weakly. She collected her throwing picks with a relieved smile. "Good. Now, what's your name? I don't want to keep calling you crazy girl inside my head." "Asuna." "Well, it's a pleasure to meet you, Asuna. I'm Sinan." Chapter 12, Finding a Reason. Sinan breathed a sigh of relief when they reached Talbana. She never relaxed until she was in the safety of her room, and this time the trip had been more stressful than usual. She looked sideways at Asuna. The chestnut-haired girl had put back her hood. She could understand that. After 20 days, players had turned back to. Well, it would never be normal, not really. But almost. Including the perverts. Sinan didn't consider herself to be beautiful, or even good-looking, but there was such a discrepancy in the male-female ratio in SAO that any girl would be flirted with. Maybe she should start wearing a hood. But no. She didn't like the message it sent. She was done hiding. Had been since the 7th day, when she left the town of beginnings. Stepping around the multitude of players crowding Talbana's main plaza, Sinan waved at Liz, who was chatting with that party she always saw her with. The spear guy, the girl with the flute, and the silent boy. Over there. Let's sit down and eat something. You look like you need it. Asuna nodded almost imperceptibly. The girl had only spoken one word since they met, and that was her name. And only after Sinan threatened to princess carry her into Talbana. After all those years as an unremarkable background student, Sinan had never thought someone could have less of a presence than she did, but Asuna was living proof that she was wrong. Pulling the girl by the wrist, Sinan wondered why she had jumped into this pit. Then she remembered she did it herself when she decided to do a good deed and save someone who had clearly suicidal tendencies. Seriously, she was literally the worst possible choice to console someone like Asuna. Sinan was a withdrawn, reclusive, not to mention bullied, high schooler, who had just one friend. She barely talked more than a sentence every day unless the teachers asked her to answer a question. And yet, here she was, drafting a speech in her head as she walked, to convince Asuna life was still worth living. They sat down at a table in the farthest corner of the restaurant in silent agreement. Neither of them wanted to be noticed. Out of goodwill, Sinan ordered for both herself and Asuna. Then, they fell into awkward silence. This continued until the food arrived, and it became clear to Sinan that Asuna would not be the first to speak. Why wasn't she surprised? All right. I went to more psychologists and psychiatrists than I thought existed, but I still have no idea how I should do this. So I will just be straightforward. Why do you want to die? Were this any other situation, Sinan would never have asked bluntly like this. Even if she said she didn't know how to do this, it was very clear that asking, "Why do you want to die?" was not the way to go. Not by a long shot. But this wasn't the real world. This was SAO. They risked their lives on a daily basis. If Asuna wanted to kill herself, there were 1,001 ways she could have done it already. But she didn't. Instead, she put herself in what was very clearly an unwinnable situation, but still tried to fight. The only conclusion Sinan could make from this was that while Asuna wanted to die, she hadn't given up on life yet. Hearing the harsh question, Asuna stopped playing with her food. Sinan didn't know if the girl was normally like that, if she was taciturn because of her dark emotions, or if she was simply exhausted because she sure looked so. Just when she thought she wouldn't get an answer, Asuna started talking. My whole life, I've always had to be perfect. Have the best grades. Learn courtesy and manners. Smile politely when my mom introduced me to men thrice my age. My one act of rebellion was to take my brother's nerve gear and put it on. And look what happened. Sinan was about to say something, anything, but the girl didn't stop. It seemed that having someone finally listen to you had broken open a dam inside Asuna. I know it's not my fault. I'm not egocentric to that point. Nobody could have known what would happen. But I put on that helmet because I wanted to be myself, even if for just a moment. I wanted a taste of freedom. Instead, I landed in another prison. And once again, I am powerless. Worthless. Sinan recoiled as if she was hit. Worthless. How could anyone think of themselves as such? But just one look told her that Asuna really did believe that. Asuna. Sinan didn't know what to say. How do you convince someone that they are still wanted, that they were still valued and loved by someone? Sinan didn't know. But she knew how to snap someone out of their guilt-induced trance. Yeah, she knew a lot about that. That's bullshit. Huh. Asuna was clearly the kind of young lady who was raised in a greenhouse, and never really experienced the real world. Not like Sinan did. Just a cuss was enough to get more reaction out of her than almost dying did. Sinan ignored her confusion, and slapped the table. A few heads turned their way, and she quickly sat down again, her words were still harsh. You are saying you are worthless because... Because of what? Because you can't beat a death game some maniac trapped us in. And in just 20 days nonetheless. Guess what, there are 9,999 other people who also can't. By your logic, we are all worthless. I didn't mean. I know. I for one don't consider myself worthless, no matter what others may say. And that's why I said you are spouting bullshit. You've made it to Talbana from the town of beginnings. You survived 20 days in a world where pretty much everything that moves is trying to kill you. 1,500 other people didn't. You are here, in the most dangerous place on the first floor, fighting alone. You are not weak, Asuna. Not by a long shot. And you are certainly not worthless. When she finished, Sinan stared at Asuna. She didn't do anything else, and just waited in silence for a few minutes. When Asuna finally took off her hood, Sinan wasn't sure if she had cried or not. But she saw steely determination in her eyes. And a lot of unease and fear too. But who didn't feel those, especially in their situation? Thank you, Sinan. I was being stupid. Looking at the pair of hazel eyes, Sinan grinned. Was that what it felt like to have a girlfriend? Just a tiny bit. Now eat before it gets cold. Asuna nodded, and dug in with such ferocity that Sinan could only stare. That didn't fit with the mental image of a young lady she had built. Slow down, Asuna, the food is not going to run away. Geez, it is as if you haven't eaten in 3 days. The pause in Asuna's hand movements and the blush that crept up to her cheeks were subtle, but Sinan noticed them. Seriously. When the girl across from her nodded sheepishly, Sinan staggered. How could someone be so careless with their well-being? But then again, Asuna had just tried to die. Frowning, Sinan remembered how the girl had collapsed for no apparent reason back in the tower. Wait. Asuna, for how long were you in the labyrinth? Asuna mumbled something under her breath which Sinan didn't quite catch. It sounded suspiciously like days, though. Days, as in plural. Asuna. 3 days. Sinan would have spat the water in her mouth had she been drinking any. She glared at Asuna. The player didn't look like she was joking. 3 days. What were you thinking? I wasn't. You. Uff. Asuna showed her an embarrassed smile which made her so cute Sinan couldn't find it in herself to scold her anymore. She just sighed and gave up. The girls didn't speak much for the rest of the meal. Just as they were leaving the restaurant, Sinan sent her a friend request, which Asuna gleefully accepted. Neither said anything about partying up. Well, SAO was big, but not that big. They would see each other again, as long as they didn't die. Sinan and Asuna split up in the plaza, each going to their respective ends. When Sinan gave the rapier user one last glance, she saw Asuna pulling up her hood again. I guess old habits die hard. Drifter kicked the covers aside and sat up. His hand habitually scrolled through his inventory, and with a few taps, his kobold spear materialized on his back. He hadn't even gotten out of bed yet. Stretching, Drifter looked at the date on his HUD, and grimaced. Day 21, huh? 3 weeks stuck in SAO. 3 weeks during which he had grown stronger. 3 weeks he and his party had been diving in the labyrinth. 3 weeks. And no progress. They were no closer to beating the game than they were the day it started. Where the fuck was the damned boss room? Sighing, Drifter sent a message to Nautilus and Yuna saying he was up, and went down to have breakfast. The meeting with Argo yesterday hadn't gone great. Apparently even the ever-cheerful info broker was starting to lose her patience. The first floor labyrinth was all but completely explored. She had sold him the latest map, and there were very few areas left. Unless they were very unlucky, they must have missed something. Or someone was messing with them. That was one guess Argo had put out there yesterday, and with which Drifter found himself agreeing more as the new day dawned. Maybe Kayaba himself had concealed the location of the first floor boss room. Why? Apart from the men being a sicko, Drifter could only imagine that it was because he wanted players to go through an adaptation period. To weed out the weak. Drifter hated himself for even thinking of it on those terms, but it made sense. What Kayaba wanted wasn't exposition or fame, he had plenty of those already. His true aim, in Drifter's view, was simple: power. The developer wanted to rule over the 10.000 players like a god. And like a god, he liked to play games. But the wait would have to end soon. A week. Drifter thought that, if they didn't find the boss room in another week at most, even the players in Talbana would give up. Of course, those were just his and Argo's conjectures. Maybe they were wrong. He hoped that was the case. Good morning, Drifter. Good morning to you too, Yuna. Where's Not? The songstress, his party member, and now one of his most cherished friends, sat down across from him. Drifter pushed the plate with sandwiches to her. Still asleep. I will wake him up soon. But what's with you? You look gloomy. Do I? Yuna nodded, and Drifter took a moment to examine himself. She was right, he wasn't feeling great today. He felt like something bad would happen. But he chalked it up to his talk with Argo. Just tired, I guess. How about we enter the tower later then? We are pretty much stun-locked without the booze room anyway. We could go to the plaza, and I can play some music. That would be great. Yeah, let's do that, Yuna. Chapter 13, Death. Drifter should have listened to his inner voice telling him to stay in bed today. He should have agreed when Yuna told them to take the day off and relax. But he didn't. Arg. He didn't turn back when the screaming started. He didn't stop running when he heard the sound of glass shattering. He got to the entrance of the labyrinth. And only then he broke down, earlier that day. Ugh. Are you sure we have to go in today? There's not much else we can do, Yun. I can think of plenty of things to do other than grinding. Like singing. Or sleeping. Pretty much anything that isn't boring. Drifter chuckled at Yuna's and Nautilus' antics. At least they were in a good mood. Drifter himself couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Later, he would learn that this kind of sixth sense was not to be ignored. But that was in the future. Now, he just shelved it in the back of his mind. That was a mistake. The trio entered the tower with practiced ease. Following their maps, they made their way towards one of the areas marked as unexplored. Long before they got there, they found one of the many ruined kobolds patrols. By now, they could deal with them with their eyes closed. Okay, that was an exaggeration. But they could exterminate the mobs without breaking a sweat, and the only casualty was a few durability points off of Nautilus' shield. With experienced and even slightly bored, but still cautious steps, the party made their way deeper into the labyrinth. Drifter looked at his map. To him, everywhere in the tower looked the same, but the map showed the dots representing themselves about to enter a foggy area. All right, we are here. Remember, we're just doing recon. Our aim is to find the boss room. Let's not bite off more than we can chew. Aye, Captain. We've done that 20 times already, Drifter. We know. Still not a reason to be careless, Yuna. The songstress pouted, but Drifter knew this was just banter. They knew what to expect of the labyrinth, and could even take on 2 kobold patrols, if not easily, then at least safely. But they still took all precautions. At this point in the game, no one still alive would be reckless inside the labyrinth. And yet, SAO claimed more lives every day. Spear drawn, Drifter advanced into the labyrinth, keeping Yuna to his left, while Nautilus stood on her other side. Mobs could spawn anywhere, and as the one with the lowest defense stat in their party, the musician always found herself flanked by her 2 companions. Even if this unconscious action by the 2 of them annoyed her sometimes, that feeling was always overwhelmed by the warmth she felt. Suddenly, Drifter stopped, his eyes glowing green. Recognizing the use of the searching skill, Nautilus and Yuna halted, hands gripping their weapons tight. Drifter. Kobold patrol just around that bend. Just one. Should we? Nautilus and Yuna nodded. If they wanted to continue exploring, they had to follow this path. And you didn't leave mobs behind you. That would be asking to die. They heard the growling and snarling before they turned the corner. One of the things every player both loved and greatly disliked about SAO was that mobs worked in an aggro range. Meaning, sometimes you could waltz right in front of their eyes and they would do nothing, but other times they had their backs turned to you, but you would still be found before being able to get within striking distance. Which was what happened now. But even that could work in their favor if they used it right. The first ruined kobold turned the corner running, one-handed axe ready to cleave someone in half. The mob was met with Nautilus' shining blade. Horizontal square tore into the monster, leaving 4 bright red gashes on its chest. Drifter immediately followed up his friend's skill with one of his own, bringing the ruined kobold down to 1/3 of its health. Before they could finish it off, the other 2 mobs burst through the corner, mouths open and fangs showing. Nautilus. On it. Their shield bearer and resident blade user stepped forward to intercept the kobolds. Bashing one of them in the face, he blocked the other with his weapon. Seeing that he had things under control for now, Drifter turned his full focus to the first mob. Better to cut off a finger than break 10, the saying went. Or something like that. While he parried an axe strike, Yuna moved for the first time, her small frame allowing her to duck under the ruined kobold's arm, her dagger biting deeply into the creature's midriff with a K9. According to Argo, once her mastery of that skill got high enough, there would be a bonus bleeding effect. For now, it just did a ton of damage and left the mob howling in pain. Drifter quickly put an end to its cries. Not, switch. Without missing a beat, Drifter rushed to assist Nautilus. The blade user got another blow in before jumping back, and allowing Drifter to get a clean line of sight at the ruined kobold he was facing. With a rage spike, he launched the mob in the air. Switch was a new technique the party had been working on lately. It was Argo who had told them about it, actually. And free of charge, to their shock and suspicion. Apparently it was something commonly used in other MMOs. To keep control of the rhythm of the battle, players would trade places, allowing the one who was just at the front lines to catch their breath. This also allowed them to fill the gap after a skill had been used, both dishing out more damage and stopping the mobs from taking advantage of that opportunity. Their switch was far from perfect. They learned that when they moved on from training against dire wolves to ruined kobolds. Turns out, every mob has its own speed, stats, and attack patterns. That was painfully obvious, but it had somehow slipped their minds. To make the move work, you needed to take into account everything, from how much knockback the mob took, to how fast it recovered. Not to mention, you needed to be in sync with the one you were performing the switch. And that changed with every player. More than once they tripped into each other because Drifter tried to switch with Yuna the same way he did with Nautilus. But this time the switch worked well. Ruined kobolds were just first-floor mobs, after all. Their AI was predictable. That left some room for error even if they somehow messed up. Unfortunately, even if Drifter's party did everything perfectly, fate had unavoidable troubles in store for them. Just as he prepared to hit the mob again and bring it down to red, that very same bad premonition he had been having since early came back, and stronger. He just had to look around to find the source. Well, shit. Language, not. I don't know, Yuna. I think he summed it up pretty good. Shit. 3 sources of light indicated the arrival of 3 more ruined kobolds. And they couldn't have spawned in a worse position, right behind the party, surrounding them and cutting off their escape path. Drifter's mind briefly went to that survivor he saw the day he arrived in Talbana. It was probably like this that his party was wiped out. No way in hell I'm allowing that to happen. Nautilus, Yuna, we're gonna have to fight our way out. Saying that was unnecessary. The moment they saw the ruined kobolds spawn, Nautilus redoubled his efforts in killing the one he was facing against. Even one less mob would already increase their survival odds exponentially. On the same wavelength as her childhood friend, Yuna stabbed the monster with her dagger. What she lacked in technique, she made up for in speed, which was exactly what they needed. Meanwhile, Drifter was abusing the longer reach of his spear to keep the newly spawned patrol at bay. Ha! With a shout, he cast horizontal arc, knocking back 2 of the mobs. The third one managed to get through and struck with its own spear, drawing a red line along his arm. Panicking ever so slightly, Drifter pulled back his arm and used his tried and tested specialty, and kicked the ruined kobold in the groin. He had no idea if that did as much damage as it would to a human, probably not, but it worked well enough to push the mob back. Quickly thrusting forward twice, he managed to poke 2 holes in the other mobs, and heard Yuna and Nautilus cheer as the second of the original ruined kobolds shattered. Their joy was short-lived, however, and Drifter heard Yuna yell in fear. Unable to stop himself, he turned his head and saw the songstress with a long red gash on her shoulder. The remaining kobold she and Nautilus were facing still had his axe glowing red from double cleave. Yuna! Yuna! Both men shouted, and Nautilus turned his sword onto the offender with such ferocity even Drifter would be scared if he saw it. But in his moment of distraction, a ruined kobold managed to slip through his guard, and buried its axe in Drifter's side. His health fell into the yellow zone, and he was forced to forget Yuna's peril in favor of his own. With a grunt, he smashed the butt of his kobold spear against the mob's snout, then, while it was disoriented, he pierced its eye and entire head. That triggered a critical hit, and the ruined kobold was killed. Drifter stumbled back until he was next to his party members again. A quick look at the HUD showed that they were all at about half health. But now it was 3 on 3, and the mob's health bars weren't that much fuller than theirs. Downing a health potion, he saw Nautilus and Yuna do the same. We are almost through it. His arms burning, Drifter stabbed at the closest kobold. At the same time, he heard Yuna starting to play a familiar melody, and saw a symbol light up on his HUD. They were going to make it. Help! As one, their heads snapped to the source of the voice shouting help. On the far end of the path they were on, running in their direction, were 2 players, being chased by no less than 5 ruined kobolds. As they watched, one of the mobs lunged forward, his axe finding purchase in the back of the slowest man. His companion didn't even look back as he fell. Drifter, Yuna, and Nautilus didn't have time to feel outraged. They witnessed in shock as the unfortunate player was ganged upon by the ruined kobolds, and killed. Having seen a similar scene twice before, Drifter was the first to recover. He swept his spear to the left, knocking back a kobold, and shouted at his party. Hurry up! We have to kill them before they get here or we are finished. They were already in a bad state. Even with the health potions and Yuna's arrest, their HP was still hanging precariously in the yellow zone. If they had to face 8 ruined kobolds, even with the help of the other player, who was in an even worse situation than them, there would be no way to survive. His shout woke Nautilus and Yuna up from their stunned state. Trauma could come later. Now they had to survive. Orf. Nautilus decapitated one of the kobolds. Now there were 2 left. The player and his pursuers were less than 40 meters away. Ugh. Willingly taking a hit, Drifter buried his spearhead into a ruined kobold's leg. That was enough to wipe out what little was left of its HP. He turned to look at the incoming attackers, and his heart stopped. The player who had been running towards them, shouting for help, had disappeared. But it couldn't be. He hadn't heard him yell, nor the sound of glass shattering that accompanied a player's death. Regardless of what he thought, the 5 ruined kobolds who had been hunting the player now turned their sights to Drifter's party. He heard Nautilus curse and Yuna let out a choked sob. Some kind of instinct alerted Drifter that something was wrong. His eyes glowed green, and he stared at a certain spot just a few meters to the left of the group of mobs. His expression morphed into one of intense fury and disgust. Run! Yelling just this one word to his friends, Drifter used a horizontal to get rid of the last ruined kobold that was harassing them. Then he brought his spear up above his shoulder, holding it awkwardly. His gaze fixed on the spot he had pinpointed before, he threw his kobold spear with all his might. Without waiting to see if he hit his target, he turned around and grabbed Yuna and Nautilus, who were still frozen, by their arms, and started running. From behind came a grunt of pain which definitely didn't belong to a kobold. Yuna staggered, and tried to search for the person who yelled. What she saw were the 5 ruined kobolds halt their pursuit, and change their target to the very same player she thought had died. Wait. He is still. Run, Yuna. Before they aggro back onto us. Dragging his friend, Drifter stopped her from turning back. Low on health and exhausted as they were, even a single ruined kobold could spell their doom, let alone 5. And it wasn't worth it. Not for him. Arg. Drifter felt Yuna shiver in his grasp when she heard the scream. He didn't stop. He didn't look back. Not even when he heard the sound of glass shattering. He didn't let his party members stop either. Only when they left the labyrinth that they finally ended their mad sprint. Drifter. Gasping for air, Drifter collapsed. He refused to look up and meet Yuna's eyes, ashamed. It was only when she didn't say anything else that he raised his head. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking above him. Training his gaze upwards, Drifter saw it. His cursor had turned orange. Chapter 14, found it. Drifter stared at the cursor above his head. Usually, it would be green. Most players were green. His had been until a few minutes ago. But not anymore. Now it was orange. The mark of a criminal. In SAO, there were 3 colors a player's cursor could have. Those colors also indicated what they were. Green was how they started, and it showed you were a normal player. You could talk with NPCs, enter cities, and there would be no restrictions when your cursor was green. Then there was orange. A player turned orange when they attacked another player. It was the color of criminals. They couldn't talk to most NPCs nor enter cities. Finally, there was red. The color reserved for PKers, or player killers. They would be arrested on sight in case they tried to enter a city. In most games, you could turn your cursor back to orange and green with time and some special quests. Not in Sword Art Online. Here, once you turned red, you were red forever. Because that was the color of a player killer. A murderer. Drifter. What the hell happened? The spearman snapped out of his trance when Nautilus asked him the question he didn't want to hear. But he couldn't deny it, nor did he want to. He did what he believed he had to do to survive. To make sure Nautilus and Yuna survived. That player. He didn't die. He used a skill. Hiding. It's what Argo uses to sneak up on us. If your mastery is high enough, you can disengage from combat, amongst other things. His clearly wasn't. Normally, it would just confuse the ruined kobolds for a second before they found him again. But he used it just at the right moment. Right when we entered their range. His friends took a moment to understand what he was saying. When they did, looks of horror crossed their faces. Instead of him, they aggroed on us. We tried to save him, and he wanted to kill us. Yuna looked positively scandalized. Nautilus just sat down on the grass, holding his head with his hands. But Drifter denied Yuna's claims. He didn't want to kill us. He wanted to survive, so he did what he thought he had to. Just like I did. What do you mean? His hiding wasn't too high-leveled. I can know that because my searching found him. An. I didn't want to die. I didn't want you to die. So I threw my spear at him. It hurt him. And broke his hiding. He was still the primary target for the kobold's aggro, so they turned back to him. Drifter didn't dare look at his companions while he spoke. He just stared at the orange prism above his head. He couldn't even enter a city anymore. He was a criminal now. No, he was a murderer. The system only didn't recognize him as such because he wasn't the one who landed the final blow. But that player was dead because of him. Even if he deserved it for trying to use them as bait and sacrifices, it didn't change the fact. Drifter killed him. Silence. That was all there was after Drifter finished speaking. When he finally couldn't withstand it anymore, he tore his gaze away from his cursor. However it was that they looked at him now, he had to face them. Pity. And also confusion, anger, and fear. But mostly pity. Drifter didn't know if it was because of the dead player or himself. He wasn't sure he wanted to know. Yuna and Nautilus were sitting with their arms around each other, looking at him. He could see they found comfort in the presence of each other after such a harrowing experience. And crouching right in front of them, so close he could touch them if he unfolded his arm, Drifter never felt more alone. The trio just stared at each other like that for a long while. Eventually, Drifter couldn't stand it anymore. When he spoke, his voice was shaky. Yuna, Nautilus, I don't. Not now, Drifter. I know what you want to say. And if you say it right now, I might accept it. Nautilus stopped him. By his side, Yuna nodded ever so slowly in agreement. Drifter bit his lips. Then he covered his mouth with his hand and let out a muffled scream. Finally, he too nodded. All right. I will. Ugh. You two should get going. Go to the inn, get some rest. I can't enter the city. And it won't be good for anyone if someone sees you together with an orange player. What about you? Drifter frowned. Then he got up, his back turned to his friends. If they even still considered themselves such. There are safe zones other than the cities. I'm going to sleep on one of them. When my orange status wears off. Tomorrow. Tomorrow we are going to talk. Yeah. Okay. Come on, Yun. Drifter heard their footsteps getting farther away. Once they were completely gone, he set off to one of the caves marked as a safe zone on his map. He couldn't get the image of Yuna's light brown eyes burrowing into his during the entire time he was talking to Nautilus. He didn't know what emotions he saw in them, if any at all. Yuna hadn't spoken a single word after she understood what he did. And that hurt him more than what happened in the labyrinth. It hurt him more than he ever thought possible. Yun. Please say something. Nautilus looked at his oldest friend. They were sitting on her bed back at the inn, after having dodged Agil's and Liz's questions about why Drifter wasn't with them. And the entire time, Yuna hadn't opened her mouth. Nautilus was worried about her. It was the first time he watched someone die. And two people at once, one of them having died as a direct consequence of one of his party members, or former party member, as he noticed Drifter had dissolved the party even before they arrived in Talbana, actions. It was a lot to take in. He knew the only reason he wasn't throwing up was because Kayaba hadn't coded that into the game. He was still trying to get over the fact that the player had wanted to kill them. Maybe that hadn't been his objective at the start. Maybe he just wanted to survive, like all of them. But to think that someone would so readily sacrifice others, people who were willing to help, even if they knew it might be impossible. It left Nautilus shaken to the core. He is so scared, not. So scared. Yuna's voice was a whisper, barely audible. But he heard her. And he didn't need to ask who she was talking about. Nautilus didn't say anything. He just tightened his hold on Yuna, hugging her with one arm. He wanted to say we should split up, didn't he? That we should break up the party. Permanently. That's what I think too. And that's why I didn't let him speak. I was afraid I would accept. Yuna choked, trying, and failing, to force back a sob. Her tears started spilling out, and she buried her face in Nautilus' shoulder. Why? Why would he suggest that if he was so scared we would agree? That was the question that was bothering Nautilus too. Even when Yuna cried herself to sleep, he still didn't have an answer. Laying his friend in her bed, he got up and returned to his room. He didn't want to close his eyes tonight. He was afraid of what he would see. Dawn of the next day found Nautilus and Yuna silently eating their breakfast at the inn's dining room. They had yet to message Drifter, or talk about it. They were both still in shock. Which was why Argo appearing now of all times couldn't be worse. Scratch that, it could. Because the info broker's gaze immediately found them, and she stomped her way to their table in a way that was surprisingly threatening considering her size. What happened? What do you mean, Argo? Don't give me this shit, Nautilus. I want to know what happened to Drifter. The fact that Argo was speaking normally was scary. That she knew something had happened, and that it involved Drifter, was frankly terrifying. Nautilus and Yuna exchanged glances, before the songstress meekly spoke up. We can't tell you, Argo. Not without speaking with him first. And how will you do that, huh? He set his messages to private. I know that because I've been trying to reach him the whole night, since you two arrived alone, and nothing gets through. I went to the Monument of Life to make sure he was still alive. Nautilus didn't think he had ever heard Argo yell that loudly. Luckily the inns had a good sound insulation system, or the whole of Talbana would have come to check out what was happening. Argo. Tell me. What happened? Once again, Yuna and Nautilus looked at each other. They knew they weren't getting out of there without spilling everything. And Argo was Drifter's oldest friend. All right. Yesterday we went into the labyrinth like always. 5 minutes later, Yuna had finished explaining what happened, somehow managing not to break down again in the middle of it. Argo's chocolate brown eyes stared at her the entire time, as if to make sure she wasn't hiding anything. When Yuna was finished, the info broker snarled. That's it. What do you mean that's it? 2 players died. And one of them was because of us. Argo scoffed at Nautilus. She held 4 fingers up. 4 people died, actually. Valadin's party didn't come back last night. It lines up with what you told me. But that's not important. What is important is that, because Drifter became an orange player, you abandoned him. Argo shouted, and this time it definitely did turn some heads their direction. But Yuna couldn't care less. She recoiled, stung by the anger in the info broker's words. Suddenly, she forgot everything else. Now, she just felt pathetic. While she was over here feeling conflicted about Drifter having caused someone's death to save their lives, the infamous Argo the Rat was so worried about his well-being that she was willing to throw her reputation away. She wasn't even his party member. They were. We didn't abandon him. We just. Seeing Yuna being berated, Nautilus jumped in her defense, but one stare from Argo effectively shut him down. The fact that Yuna seemed too shell-shocked to argue didn't help. We did abandon him, didn't we? The songstress voice, usually so clear, was a rough whisper. Argo's expression softened a little. Yes, you did. I can tell you didn't mean it, and just needed some space, but it doesn't change that. Dri boo. He told you too about what happened before Kayaba went megalomaniac on us, didn't he? Yes. He was partying with someone, and she disconnected in front of him. He didn't think it meant anything at the time, but... And what else? What do you mean? That's all. Nah, it ain't. Dri boo feels sad about that player, but he knows there was nothing he could have done. But he also saw someone else die on the first day. A player who suicided off of the Town of Beginning's edge. Both of those hit Dri boo hard. One of the reasons he left the Town of Beginnings was 'cause he wanted to get stronger and not feel so powerless again. And now, before he could accomplish that, he was the direct cause of another player's death. Can you imagine how he's feeling right now? 'Cause I can't. But I know it's bad. Argo's voice got lower the more she spoke. By the end, it was all but a whisper under her breath. But each word impacted Yuna and Nautilus like thunder. Talk to him. Don't leave him alone, or I dunno what he's gonna do. But don't hurt him. Or Imma gonna make your life here miserable. Neither of the two doubted the info broker could carry out the threat. But they didn't need the added incentive. If, after hearing what she said, they still wanted to abandon Drifter, and the thought never actually crossed their minds, they just needed time, then they would be worse than trash. Which was why, when Argo got up, Yuna grabbed her wrist. Come with us, Argo. He needs all the support he can. That includes you. Light brown and chocolate brown eyes met. Argo nodded. Drifter stared at his 3 friends. He had no idea how they had found him after he disbanded the party and blocked all message requests. He also didn't know why Argo was here too. But above all else, he didn't understand why they were here. You lookin' worse for wear, heh, Dri boo. Instead of answering, Drifter's hands went above his head, as if to cover his orange cursor. The color was already lighter than yesterday, and it would probably be back to green tonight, but he still didn't want Argo to see it, even though the rational part of his mind was telling him that if she was here, she already knew everything. His actions cracked the already forced smile the info broker had. Nautilus and Yuna hadn't even tried to fake their expressions. Before he knew it, Argo was hugging Drifter, her smaller frame wrapped around his. Yuna was right behind her, arms latched around his neck, and Drifter could feel her tears flowing down her face before dissipating into particles. Nautilus didn't hug him, but put a hand on Drifter's shoulder to show his support. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. At first, Drifter didn't know how he should react to the surprise group hug. He was still processing the fact that they were there, after they left so abruptly yesterday. But when Yuna started repeating the same 3 words with her face pressed to his neck, he returned the hug. He didn't ask why she was apologizing. It was pretty obvious she felt guilty. Shoo. It's okay. Everything's fine. With one arm holding the trembling songstress, and his other hand caressing Argo's hair, Drifter gave a firm nod to Nautilus, and blinked the tears away. Everything was going to be okay. December 2nd, 2022, somewhere in the first floor labyrinth. Switch. Before the word was even fully spoken, the shield bearer had already bashed the ruined kobold in the face, forcing it back. From behind him, a smaller figure jumped forward, dagger carving a bloody wound, or at least it would be, if the mob bled something more than red polygons, along the monster's torso. Switch. An old and rusty spear flashed over the dagger user, piercing the ruined kobold through its left shoulder, and effectively crippling it. With a heave, the spearman pulled back his weapon, tearing off the mob's entire arm, which shattered, followed soon by the one it was previously attached to. Good job. Drifter high-fived Yuna, and bumped fists with Nautilus. Their switch still wasn't perfect. But it was getting there. After they had singled it out, the ruined kobold hadn't been able to attack once. While Yuna and Nautilus exchanged a high-five themselves, Drifter couldn't help but smile. Boy, was he glad Argo had brought the 2 of them to his hiding spot a few days ago. Even if he now owned her 3 months of free intel, and that wasn't just an arbitrary value, but rather the payment the info broker had asked. Leave it to the rat to make it a business deal even when she had yet to wipe her tears away. Speak of the devil and he shall appear. Or she, in this case. Drifter was just thinking about Argo when his HUD pinged with a message from her. When he opened it, his mind went blank. Chapter 15, First Floor Boss Strategy Meeting December 3, 2022, Talbana. Drifter found himself sitting in an old Roman-style amphitheater, complete with ruins and everything, just after lunch. Yuna was sitting on the stairs to his left, while Nautilus was on his other side. 24 other players, many of which Drifter recognized from their dungeon dives, were also sparsely populating the amphitheater, and more were arriving. Yo, man. So you are here too, huh? A large shadow covered the trio, and Drifter craned his neck to see the merchant Agile. On his back was a giant double-bladed axe Drifter had yet to see him use. Hi. Hello, Agile. What's up? If there's any chance this is true, we can't miss it. The party greeted Agile and his friends, whom Drifter vaguely remembered seeing behind their stalls in Talbana's plaza. Was the Blackman trying to create a band of merchant warriors? The rat herself helped spread the word, so it should be true. Yeah. The first step to freedom, huh? We haven't taken the step yet, just found the path. Their words were somewhat cryptic, but they understood each other. Just because they finally saw a light at the end of the tunnel, it didn't mean it would be easy to reach it. The 2,000 players who died during this first month were more than enough evidence that SAO was an unforgiving game, especially to the unprepared and overconfident. After Agile bid Drifter and his friends goodbye and went to sit closer to the stage with the other sellers, Drifter reclined on the stairs, thinking of Argo's message. How those 3 simple words had thrown him in a loop. According to Yuna, he was staring blankly at space, his menu was set to private, for a good 20 seconds. They even thought he was suffering from lag. After 28 days and 2,000 deaths, a party had finally found the boss room. This meeting had been called to discuss how to proceed. They had to take on this fight, obviously. But how to go about it was the question. While most of the parties in Talbana could now easily deal with a kobold patrol, it stood to reason that the boss would be much stronger. Why so serious, ya 3? To their credit, Drifter, Yuna, and Nautilus barely jumped when they heard Argo's cheeky whisper right behind them. They were getting used to the jump scares the info broker was so fond of. It didn't make it any less surprising, though, and Yuna growled with a not quite a smile that had Argo yelping and hiding behind Drifter. Argo. H. How are ya, Yu-chan? Drifter facepalmed at their antics, while Nautilus chuckled. Ruffling Argo's hair in a way he knew would annoy her, Drifter caught her attention. Her pout was adorable, especially with those 6 whiskers of hers. Say, little rat, you wouldn't happen to know more about this meeting, would you? Nah. The guy who found the boss room just asked me to help spread the word. He wanted the higher-leveled players, not the noobs. Ignoring how dismissive of the majority of players the info broker was, Drifter nodded. Nautilus seemed confused, though. Wouldn't having more people be better? The one who answered was neither Argo nor Drifter but Yuna. Nope. Having new arrivals join the boss fight just because they are eager to do something would be a mistake. Especially considering this is the first floor boss we ever met. Ilfang is bound to be different than the labyrinth mobs, even if he is also a kobold. Yuchan is right on the money, not Boo. Even if Ilfang is the exact same as the beta, it's gonna be a hard battle. What we need are players who are used to fighting, not some noobs who think they can take on the world. That would end badly. And this being the first floor boss battle, we need it to be perfect. Drifter added the last statement, his eyes narrowed as he remembered everything that was written in Argo's guidebook about Ilfang the Kobold Lord. It was no news to anyone in the three-people party that the info broker was a beta tester, but Argo was always the first to say that SAO wasn't the same as in the beta. They couldn't botch this battle. They needed to take down Ilfang on the first try, and without any casualties. If they failed, or if a lot of people died, then the remaining 8,000 players in Aincrad would lose all hope. And when that happened, all their chances of escaping their virtual prison would be gone with them. Oh, is that Kibu I see? I will talk to y'all later. Like the mini tornado of chaos that she was, Argo left without a proper goodbye. Her mastery in hiding was so high that they lost sight of her after a few steps. Even Drifters searching couldn't find the info broker unless she was within a 5 meters range of him. He knew that because he had tried it before. That was a bet he was never going to take again. Drifter tried in vain to find the Kibu whom Argo had mentioned. He was curious about who it was other than him, but he knew their relationship was unusual, that could get Argo so excited. The fact that it was a boy also activated his big brother's instincts. Okay, let's get started, people. His attention was directed back to the stage in the center of the amphitheater, where a player with blue hair, again, was clapping his hands. Drifter recognized him as Diavel, the leader of the party he once encountered in the labyrinth. Nodding gravely to Yuna and Nautilus, Drifter turned his full focus to the player. Things were about to get serious. Thank you for responding to my summons today. My name is Diavel. My job is. In my own mind, I like to think I'm a knight. Or not. Drifter couldn't help but join in the chuckles that echoed around the amphitheater. Even Yuna, who was a complete noob in gaming a few weeks ago, snorted in amusement. There was no such thing as a job or classes in SAO. Diavel let the players jeer and joke for a few more seconds before raising his hands and asking for silence. His face suddenly turned serious, and an ominous tension befell all the people in the amphitheater. Yesterday, our party discovered the boss room at the top of the tower. Drifter winced in pain when he felt Yuna clutch his arm. Even if they already expected it, to receive confirmation like that really put all of them on edge. He could see it was the same for everyone else. We need to defeat the boss, reach the second floor, and tell everyone waiting in the town of beginnings that it is possible to beat this game. Diavel spoke quietly, but his voice reached all of them. It was filled with resolve and determination. And that is the duty of every one of us here now. Isn't that right, everybody? Even before the other players started shouting and clapping, Drifter had his fists clenched. Diavel's words aligned perfectly with Drifter's thoughts. As the best players in SAO, the frontliners, per se, it was their obligation to beat Ilfang, and restore hope to all the trapped players. Okay. Then, without further delay, I'd like to get this boss raid meeting started. First, I want you to team up into parties of 6. Diavel took control of the meeting, but Drifter had no qualms with that. The man was a natural leader. He found the boss room, made a deal with Argo to share the news only with the qualified players, then organized a meeting to plan the battle. Drifter liked to be the head of his small party, but he already had his hands full just with the 3 of them. Speaking of parties. 6 members, huh? SAO allowed up to 6 people parties, so that was the natural thing to do. Furthermore, 6 was the ideal number of people. Not too many that it would be a mess, but not too few that they would be overwhelmed by enemies. Drifter's party was the odd one out, definitely. There were very few parties with fewer than 4 members. Theirs only worked because all of them were above average players. Unfortunately, it also meant it would be hard for them to find another party to merge with, even if just for the boss raid. We are only 3. See anyone else with the same numbers? Maybe Agile. Nope, he has 4 already. Maybe next time. Nautilus and Yuna had already caught on to their predicament. The songstress waved to their friendly merchant, who gave an apologetic shrug. Drifter was about to stand up to get a better view if there were any solo players or duos when Nautilus spoke hesitantly. Apparently Argo has a surprise for us. Drifter raised an eyebrow, and scanned the amphitheater. He easily spotted the info broker, now out of hiding, waving for them to come over. Next to her were 3 very uncomfortable players. He looked at his party members, who shrugged. Let's see what she has in store for us then, shall we? Argo was having the time of her life. She already knew about having to form 6-people parties, because she had discussed everything about this meeting with Diavel beforehand. They knew each other from the beta, even if their relationship wasn't close. She had just conveniently forgotten to mention it to any of her contacts. The truth was, obviously, that she wanted to laugh at Drifter, Yuna, Nautilus, and Kirito's reactions. And boy, had she gotten a chuckle out of them. Mostly Kirito, since he was a solo player, but seeing Drifter cranking his neck around to find other 3-people parties, which she knew for a fact there weren't any, had also been entertaining. And before she called Drifter and the others over, she got to watch another show. Namely, how 3 very interesting solo players got together. The stammering Kirito, who always hated to work with others, the silent hooded girl whose name she didn't know, and who didn't say a word, and the rookie Sinan, with piercing gray eyes, who always ordered a bunch of throwing pics from Liz. When the 3 were finished forming their party, after not just a little confusion, and during which Argo learned the hooded girl was called Asuna, the info broker jumped on Kirito's back, startling the boy enough that he fell a step. "Aight, Kibu. How are ya? Makin' plenty of friends, huh? Pretty gals on top of that, you're gonna make a bunch of enemies if you keep hogging them all to yourself." Before her favorite beta tester could muster an answer, Argo had already turned to the 2 girls with a big grin, which only got wider when she saw Sinan's very guarded expression. "Heya, Sin-chan, AA-chan. I don't believe we've been properly introduced. Name's Argo, best info broker on this side of Aincrad. Delighted to meet ya." Asuna still didn't say anything, but Sinan took her hand off of her dagger's pommel, and shook the one Argo was offering, very, very warily. "I've heard of you. They say you know everything, and that as long as the price is right, you will sell it." Aye. Glad to see the word spreadin'. You know that's what my business thrives in. Though I don't know everything, but I can always find out. Say, if our Kibu here was lookin' to know your 3 sizes, could I interest you in? Hey. Argo was brutally interrupted when someone grabbed her by the scruff and lifted her up. Before she started thrashing around to free herself, she met Drifter's eyes and gulped. Oh, Sinan wasn't sure of what exactly was happening. She arrived at the boss strategy meeting after someone mentioned her long-ranged abilities could be useful. Then, she met Asuna, who she hadn't seen in a good while, and the 2 sat together. Partying up seemed natural. After that, a boy about their age, with black hair and eyes, holding a one-handed sword, and looking very disgruntled by the fact they had to form parties, asked to join them. Finally, the famous Argo jumped literally out of nowhere and into Kirito's back, before she started babbling away. Some of the things she said had both her and Kirito blushing furiously. But before the info broker could go on, someone grabbed her, and Argo made the most comical gulping sound Sinan had heard in her entire life. The one lifting up Argo was a somewhat older man, and by that Sinan meant he was 19 or 20, with a spear strapped to his back. Standing next to him was a young teen holding a shield and with a curved blade sheathed on his hip, and an equally young girl carrying a flute. She recognized them. Everyone in Talbana did. The girl played every night at the main plaza without fail, and had a good crowd listening every night. "What kind of chaos do you think you are causing, little rat?" Sinan heard Kirito choke, but she couldn't blame him. She herself was trying, and failing miserably to suffocate a giggle. Seeing the infamous Argo the rat being called, well, a little rat, was somewhat hilarious. Pfft. Ha ha ha. Finally, someone couldn't hold back, and pearl-like laughter came from her left. Sinan was about as stunned as everyone else, and Argo took the chance to escape Drifter's claws and jump on Asuna, who yelped as the smaller girl started tickling her as revenge. Somehow, the hood never came off. I swear. Forget it. It seems Argo already decided we will be working together. Anyone has anything against it? Don't be shy, better break the party now than make a mistake later in the middle of the boss battle. Sinan appreciated the fact that Drifter was putting that option out there. She didn't see any reason to reject the party invitation, and neither did the other 2 solo players, but it was a good gesture. Okay, are you about done forming your parties? Then. Hold up a second. Before Diavel, back on the center of the stage, could even finish his words, someone jumped from the top of the amphitheater, skidding to a halt next to the blue-haired player. By the way, Sinan would have to ask where Diavel found hair dye, but that was a thought for another time. Now, while she looked at the fellow who had just yelled, she could only think one thing. My name's Kibu. There's something I want to say before we take on the boss. Yep, this was going to be troublesome. Kirito and Drifter's simultaneous sighs indicated that they agreed with her. Chapter 16, First Floor Boss Strategy Meeting. A note from Reis123. So, this chapter was supposed to be part of Chapter 15, but it ended up being way too big, so I split it into two. Don't worry, though, I won't make you wait another 2 days for the chapter that was supposed to be today. Enjoy a double release. My name's Kibu. There's something I want to say before we take on the boss. Some of you here. Drifter suppressed a sigh at the sight of the cactus-looking guy on the stage. He saw Diavel also push down a frown of irritation at being so rudely interrupted. Kibu was very vocal. Drifter had already discovered that when the man started an argument with Liz over some repairs he was not satisfied with. It was also from that situation that stemmed his dislike. Need to apologize to the 2.000 who have died so far. Drifter froze. While most players seemed confused, he knew exactly who Kibu was referencing. One peek at Argo's clenched jaw showed she too knew. That finger of his seemed to be pointing directly at his little info broker, and Drifter had never wanted to punch someone so much as he did now. Sneakily, he reached behind his back, and grabbed Argo's hand in his own. He didn't look at her, just gave her a reassuring squeeze. She relaxed, though she did pull closer to them, not quite hiding behind Drifter and Yuna. The songstress smiled at Argo warmly, to show that they were with her for whatever happened. So focused they were on making sure the info broker was okay, they didn't notice the glance she exchanged with Kirito. Kibu, those people you are referring to, do you mean the ex-beta testers, perhaps? Of course I do. On the day this stupid game started, the beta guys ditched us beginners, and they all disappeared. They took all the good hunting spots and easy quests for themselves, so they were the only ones getting stronger. And since then, they've just ignored the rest of us. As much as Drifter wanted to beat the player up until he shut his mouth, he had to admit Kibu was mostly right. Mostly, because while there were a lot of asshole beta testers, and that was according to Argo herself, a good number of them, info broker included, were doing their best to help other players or clear the game. Drifter didn't know many beta testers. Only one he was aware of, in fact. But he had talked with Argo, and she had disclosed some information. It had been right after that mess in the labyrinth and Drifter's brief orange state. Yuna and Nautilus were there too. The info broker said that of the 1,000 beta testers, about 700 had rejoined the game, at least that she knew of. And of the 2,000 crossed out names in the Monument of Life, almost a fifth belonged to those beta testers. Many beta testers had been selfish, and hogged all the best grinding spots and quests, yes. Quite a few of those who died had probably been because of the changes Kayaba added after the beta. They paid for their greed with their life. But they didn't amount to even half of the beta testers. Many had died while trying to clear the labyrinth while relying on old knowledge. Their aim had been to escape and free everyone else. Others had perished trying to save newbies. A few had even been in contact with Argo, helping her gather intel, and Drifter knew their deaths haunted his friend more than she would ever admit. Of the beta testers who were still alive, 3 groups could be separated. The first was of those who were hiding in the town of beginnings just like pretty much everyone else. Just because they were beta testers, didn't mean they were brave. The second group was of those fighting in the labyrinth to clear the game. Drifter suspected more than a few of the people he knew were ex-betas. As for the final group, they were those like Argo, who weren't active combatants, but were trying to use their knowledge of the beta to warn and teach new players. Drifter got the feeling Argo had told him all that because she didn't want him to feel he was ever being abandoned again. She probably was also afraid he would hate her if he found out through anyone else, such as what was happening right now with Kibu. As if he could ever get angry with his little rat. There's got to be some of them here. Guys who were beta testers. We should make them get on their knees and apologize, and give up all the items and money they've hoarded. Drifter had to hold back the urge to scoff. Surely the men could not be that stupid, right? Any hope the beta testers would show themselves and offer help went right out of the window when he demanded they gave up their items which were effectively keeping them alive. Drifter knew that if he had to give up his cobalt spear, he would be as good as dead. Beta testers were the same. As party members, we can't trust them with our lives. And they can't trust us. Oh, good, Kibu went on. Because of course he did. Why wouldn't he? All he was about to do was sow distrust between the raid group right before the battle that would decide the destiny of 8,000 people. Near him, Drifter saw Kirito frowning with a pained expression. The way Argo threw him a sympathetic look tipped Drifter off to something, but he wasn't about to poke his nose in someone else's business, especially someone he just met. He could shut Kibu up, though. Can I say something? Just as Drifter was getting up to retort the cactus hare's accusations, a familiar deep voice interrupted him. With a few steps, the black-skinned merchant took the stage. My name is Agile. Kibu, let me get this straight. You are saying that because the ex-beta testers didn't take care of them, many beginners died. That they should take responsibility, apologize, and provide compensation. Is that right? Why yeah. Kibu unconsciously took a few steps back when Agile walked right up to him. Drifter had to admit that seeing the merchant so serious was much more intimidating than his business persona normally was. You received this guidebook too, didn't you? It was provided for free at the item store, after all. Sure, I did. So what of it? It was the ex-beta testers who were distributing these. Kibu scowled, seeing his momentum halted, and Drifter almost cheered for Agile when the men turned around to show the booklet to the attending players. They were all very familiar with the book and the 3 pairs of whiskers printed on the cover. Some more than others. Drifter grinned, and, before Argo could escape, ruffled her hair. Kirito seemed especially taken aback by the fact the info broker didn't claw his eyes off. See, little rat. We are here. Argo smiled and nodded gratefully before catching herself and pushing Drifter's hand away. Bah. Anyone with a brain could tell it was a beta tester who made those. I'm sure she is an amazing and beautiful heroine. I would love to meet her one day. The party, minus Sinan and Asuna, who seemed confused, laughed. Due to their short banter, Drifter missed what Agile said next, but he could tell from Kibu's surly frown as both men returned to their seats that it convinced most players in the amphitheater that beta testers weren't all bad guys. That was for the best, as the interruption had gone for long enough. Diavel quickly took the reins back. All right. Okay, can we resume the meeting now? As for information on the boss. Actually, the latest edition of that guidebook was just issued. Drifter raised an eyebrow at Argo, who smiled cheekily. According to it, the boss name is Ilfang the Kobold Lord. Also, he has an entourage known as Ruin Kobold Sentinels. The boss is armed with an axe and a buckler. He has 4 health bars, and when the last one is in the red, he switches to a curved sword-type weapon called a Talwar. His attack pattern changes too. Diavel let his words sink in, allowing the players to realize that the boss wasn't just a bigger version of the labyrinth mobs. Ilfang the Kobold Lord had its own peculiarities, all of them deadly. Drifter had already read through the entire guide, even if it wasn't the latest version, and forced his party to do the same, so they weren't surprised. The light blue-haired player then went on to talk about money, experience, and item distribution, before dismissing the meeting. Drifter nodded. It was better to solve this now than have a problem later. All right, it seems this is it for today. The fight is tomorrow, huh? After a month, I can't believe we are finally getting round to it. Patting Nautilus' shoulder, Drifter turned to the 3 new additions to the party. The mysterious Asuna, the ranged fighter Sinan, and the possible beta tester Kirito. So. I think it's better to get this out of the way now. You 3 are all solo players, while we have been in a party for some time now. There's a big difference between fighting solo or with others, so there's bound to be some trouble and miscommunication. If y'all don't mind, we could sit down for a meal, then discuss roles, tactics, and whatnot. What do you say? Drifter knew he was kinda talking like he was calling the shots here, but he couldn't help it. His biggest worry was one of the 3 new players making a mistake, or fighting like they normally do, and putting Yuna or Nautilus in danger. Luckily, they didn't seem to mind. Sinan and Asuna nodded, while Kirito pointed at somewhere behind Drifter. Sounds great, but I think someone's coming over. Drifter spun around, and, lo and behold, Diavel was walking towards them. With the corner of his eyes, he noticed Argo disappearing, followed by a short message from her saying there was work to be done. He typed a quick reply before the raid leader arrived. So we see each other again. Glad you could come. Diavel offered his hand to Drifter first, then greeted everyone else. Asuna and Sinan answered with just a nod, as expected, but Kirito shook the man's hand. Both stared at each other for slightly longer than it was necessary, and Drifter got the distinct feeling the 2 players knew each other, but also sort of didn't. I wanted to discuss your party's role. No offense, but you are mostly a group of randoms, so I would like it if you could hang back and take care of the ads. Meaning, Diavel didn't trust them to handle the boss, and wanted them to handle the Ruin Kobold Sentinels. Instead of giving an answer directly, Drifter turned to the rest of the group. I agree. No problem. If everyone else is cool with it. Receiving affirmative responses, Drifter gestured with his head to Diavel, signaling their agreement. The player smiled brightly, and bid farewell to them, but not without giving another look to Kirito. Well, who's hungry? As if on cue, Nautilus and Kirito's stomachs rumbled. Drifter snorted, and Sinan and Asuna giggled. Yuna patted the blushing boys in the back. I know the perfect place. They might even let me sing later. Chapter 17, Ilfang the Kobold Lord rubbing his belly after what was probably the best meal he had in weeks, Kirito sighed in contentment. He usually would have saved his money to enhance his gear, and made do with just bread and that reward sauce he got from a quest, but today was a special occasion. He joined a party. Sure, it was only for the boss fight, but to him, it was a monumental occasion. Okay, maybe that was a bit of an exaggeration. But Kirito had always been that kind of socially awkward gamer kid, who went solo no matter what game he played. One by one, he looked at the other 5 on the table with him. To his left was Sinan. The girl's eyes were a piercing gray, the kind that made it look like she could see through you. Then, to his right was Drifter. Kirito could tell that the older man was trying his best not to sound like he was taking charge. He was grateful for that. Kirito already didn't work well in parties, and even more so if someone he never met tried to order him around. Next to Drifter was Nautilus, the blade user with a round shield of the songstress party. Yes, the songstress party. That was how they were known, even if Drifter was their leader. The pretty young girl who played the flute every night in Talbana's Plaza was known to all. Even Kirito listened to her from a hidden corner quite frequently. That there was someone willing to play and sing made their prison somewhat more bearable. The girl in question, Yuna, was sitting to Nautilus' right. She and Sinan had sandwiched Asuna between them, and were talking quietly but excitedly with the last member of their temporary party. Asuna. Kirito had yet to see her face. They all had, with maybe the exception of Sinan, who seemed to know her. Even during dinner, Asuna never took off her hood. Kirito couldn't help but wonder why. Throughout the meal, his gaze kept wandering to her, but he always quickly averted it. Ahem. Should we discuss tactics? Sinan cleared her throat, and Kirito turned his head to her. She seemed to be the quiet and serious type, even when she was smiling. How about we start by saying what we are good at? It will give us an idea of what to expect. Seeing that no one had an objection, Drifter went first, as the one who suggested it. Well, I'm Drifter, a spear user. I'm good at crowd control and can give vanguard fighters backup from behind them. Nautilus, close combat. I am the main tank for our party. And I'm Yuna. I play support and healing, though I can also use a dagger if the situation calls for it. Healing. Kirito couldn't help but interrupt the introductions with a surprised shout. The 2 other girls were just as shocked as him. Yuna kept the grin on her face, though she did give Drifter and Nautilus a short glance, and they nodded subtly. They probably had discussed ahead of time if they should reveal Yuna's ability or not. Yes, healing. It's very little and very slow, but I can regen health through my songs. Kirito and Sinan looked at each other, mouths open but unsure of what to say. So, the girl decided to just push past it and introduce herself. I'm Sinan, as you already know. I also use a dagger, but what I'm really good with are these. Sinan showed the many throwing picks she carried with her. Kirito had already noticed them before, and he would have to ask her where he could get a few. Pity SAO doesn't have bows, I would love to try one. Asuna. I use a rapier. I'm fast but I don't deal as much damage in a single hit as others. A rapier, huh? Asuna probably put all her stat points into DEX. That was what Kirito would do in her place, at least. That meant she would be fragile. Asuna and Drifter could probably partner up as crowd control, or maybe the swordswoman might be better placed on standby, ready to switch in at a moment's notice. Kirito. Startled, he realized everyone was looking at him, waiting for the last member of their party, him, to introduce himself. Meanwhile, he had been staring at Asuna, deep in thought, for the last few seconds, trying to think how to better coordinate with her. Kirito felt his cheeks burning. Wah. I'm Kirito, and I use a one-handed sword, no shield. My major attributes are STR and DEX. The group lapsed into silence after they finished the introductions. Drifter seemed to be thinking, his fingers scratching his chin, while the others were just quietly looking at their empty plates or each other. The one who broke the silence was Sinan. I guess. Nautilus and Kirito are our vanguards. Drifter, Asuna, and myself are the second line, and Yuna supports us from the back. Kirito found himself nodding, and so did the others. That was the best party configuration they could use considering they knew practically nothing about each other. Drifter seemed to think the same. We don't have time to train together before the boss raid, so we will have to make do. I believe it would be for the best if, during the fight, we each did our own thing, but keeping an eye open. Temporary party we may be, but we must have each other's back. The way the spearman said that left no room for discussion. Especially that last sentence. Kirito, no, not just him, everyone, sensed the steel-like resolve behind it. The kind that had a very good reason, and probably not a pleasant one. What about the switch, Drifter? Nautilus raised a question that had Asuna and Sinon tilting their heads in confusion, or at least that was what he thought the slight moving of the hood meant. Kirito, on the other hand, nodded thoughtfully. Right. Do any of you know how to switch? Sorry if I'm being blunt, but it is a technique that involves 2 players, and you are all solo. Kirito raised his hand. Asuna and Sinon didn't. He saw Drifter consider things for a moment, then pull up his menu. From how his eyes moved, he guessed the spearman was looking at the clock. Then he looked back at the group. Switch is a must-know. Do you think we can get some training in today? It's night already. I don't mean in the tower, just the wolves and pigs outside. We can have 2 of us keeping watch while the others practice. That could be a good idea. Even if there isn't much time, just understanding how a switch works would be beneficial. It would also give us a chance to fight as a party. The Ruin Kobold Sentinels spawn in duos or trios according to the guidebook, so we can target fighting multiple enemies too. Sorry, but can I ask what is a switch? Kirito had been so focused in his exchange with Drifter, how had that even happened anyway? That Sinon was forced to interrupt both of them. Kirito scratched his head somewhat embarrassed, while Drifter only smiled. Sorry, we got too distracted there. By the way, I'm glad to see you opening up more, Kirito. That's some quick thought you've put into this night outing. This time Kirito definitely blushed at the praise. Drifter grinned, then turned to the rest of the party. I don't think we should decide on a party leader, considering we know almost nothing of each other. I would. I am reluctant to entrust my life to you, no offense. I believe you should feel the same. Which is even more reason why any and all suggestions should be shared, even if you think they are dumb. Better that than to regret it later on, don't you agree? When several heads nodded, Drifter smiled, and Kirito saw once again that glint in his eyes. Then the spearman turned to him, and Kirito suddenly had the feeling he should have kept his mouth shut. Back to your question, Sinon. Kirito, would you mind explaining? It was an hour and a half later, already deep into the night, that Asuna and Sinon found themselves back at the inn, this time in the room they would be sharing, just tonight. With the sudden influx of players in Talbana, there were no more single rooms left, so they decided that the boys would sleep in one room, and the girls in another. That also meant Yuna was sleeping with them. Not that Sinon was complaining. The musician was one of the kindest and most charming people she had ever met. Not to mention the songs she played after dinner were beautiful. For a moment there, Sinon had forgotten she was inside Kyaba's death game. The girl in question was humming a melody as she unpacked, in SAO, that meant a few clicks on the menu. When she was done, she plopped down on her bed, sighing. Sinon wondered why that was, but then noticed the songstress was looking at Asuna, who had finally unequipped her cloak. Whoa. You are pretty, Asuna. The rapier user, Sinon had heard someone call her a fencer, blushed promptly, then smiled so sweetly even Sinon was moved. There was something about those hazel eyes of hers that could captivate just about anyone. Thank you. Yuna grinned, and the 3 girls chatted for a while more. But there was something weighing on her newest acquaintance's mind. Sinon could tell by the way the songstress opened her mouth but said nothing, or how she kept frowning at her HUD. What's wrong, Yuna? Ah, it's nothing. That meant it clearly was something, but Sinon wasn't about to pry. The trio fell in silence for the next few seconds, before Yuna spoke again. Actually. You don't need to say it if you don't want to, Yuna. That was Asuna. Quiet as she may be, she was pretty quick to open up to others, Sinon discovered. Or maybe it was because they were going to fight their most dangerous battle yet tomorrow, so even Asuna was feeling chatty. No, it's not that I don't want to speak about it, Asuna. Okay, it kinda is. It's just. I want to ask you two a favor, but it is somewhat embarrassing to do that since this is the first time we met. Well, after she said that, there was no way the two wouldn't at the very least hear her out. Sinon gave Yuna an encouraging grin, while Asuna moved to sit a little closer to the songstress. Go ahead, Yuna. We belong to the same party now, so you don't need to hesitate to ask for help. Thanks. How should I say it? Both of you seem like level-headed people. I will be at the back playing, so I wanted to ask if you could keep an eye out for Knot and Drifter. They can both get quite into it during a fight. Especially Drifter. He is somewhat overprotective of his party members. That will include you, of course. But he might endanger himself because of that. Asuna just nodded, as if it was a no-brainer. Sinan was a little more cautious, not because she saw any reason to reject, that was just her nature. Sure, no problem. But it feels like there's a story there. Yuna smiled, but it was a weary, tired one. There is. Maybe someday I can tell it, if you decide to stick around. Let's see how the raid tomorrow goes. Yeah, December 3rd, 2022, first floor labyrinth. Clang. With a loud noise, Diavel stabbed his sword into the ground. He was looking at the 48 players that composed the boss raid party. Behind him were huge, menacing double doors, with many iron engravings, and dimly illuminated by flickering torches. Listen up everyone. I have only one thing to say. Diavel met each player's gaze as he spoke. Drifter gripped the shaft of his spear, his determination mirrored by all the other players. Let's win. Without wasting time, maybe because he didn't want to give anyone the chance to back out, the leader of the raid party placed his hand on the doors, which opened with just a touch. Cautiously, the players entered the boss room, a long hall shrouded in darkness. It didn't stay that way for very long. As the group walked inside, the room lit up, revealing the monstrosity sitting on a throne at the opposite end. With a roar that shook all of them to their very core, the monster jumped across the hall to meet them. Ilfang the Kobold Lord, Chapter 18, Kyaba's Machinations. Argo was feeling anxious. Sitting in a corner of her favorite rooftop in Talbana, overlooking the central plaza, she nervously played with her hair. Normally, she would be contacting her informants, organizing her notes, and scheming how to sell her intel for the best value. But now, she couldn't put her mind at ease. Kirito had just sent her a short message saying they were in front of the boss room. She had done her best throughout this month to uncover every possible bit of information about Ilfang the Kobold Lord that she could. She even completed every available quest on the first floor to try and see if there was something new. The only thing she couldn't do was fight with the raid party. She just hoped everything went well. Their escape and survival hinged on them winning this fight without many casualties. Or, better yet, without any at all. They couldn't lose. The info broker was so focused on her inner thoughts that it took her a few seconds to notice the blinking in her HUD. It was a different kind of notification than any she had ever come across. It looked almost like a camera. Unsure, she tapped on it. The next moment, her jaw dropped. Holy shit, hiya. With a last mournful wail, a ruined kobold was sliced in two. Seeing no more mobs nearby, Klein sheathed his katana, and inspected his party. They were tired, but otherwise unharmed. Klein felt proud of them. It had taken him and his friends a good while to leave the town of beginnings after the first day. They were afraid, there was no nice way to put it. But they made it in the end. Sure, this was just the second day they entered the tower, since they didn't feel confident in their skills before. But they were here. If we keep the pace we will catch up to the big leagues in no time, boss. Yeah. The wannabe samurai fist-bumped one of his party members. Sometimes Klein regretted not having insisted more to have Kirito join him and his friends. If the black-haired boy had, Klein knew they would already be part of the big leagues. But even if that wasn't the case for now, they were making good progress, or so he believed. Boss, you need to see this. Confused by the hesitant tone, Klein turned to one of his friends, at the same time noticing the new notification on his HUD. Thinking it was a new message, he absent-mindedly clicked it. A screen popped into existence in front of him, and Klein's eyes bulged when he saw what it was showing. Holy shit, throughout the entire first floor of Aincrad, thousands of players discovered the new icon in their menus, and opened it almost out of reflex. Those same thousands of players then did a double take, absolute shock coloring their faces. They watched on the screen in front of them as 40-some players warily entered a dark hall. Then they saw that same hall light up, and a monster well over 3 meters tall confront the players. Roar. The beastly scream echoed throughout the first floor, especially in the town of beginnings and Talbana, where thousands of players were gathered. They watched in fear and horror as a couple of words appeared above the monster. Ilfang the Kobold Lord. The players were so focused on the scenes showing that they barely noticed the title manifesting into existence above the screens in a dramatically late way that screamed Akihiko Kaiba, somewhere in Japan, a man in his mid-30s slept in a position that was certain to give him a neck ache, body bending over his desk, head resting on his crossed arms, and glasses crooked, somehow managing not to fall. "Sir." "Wah." "What?" With a loud noise, someone barged into the room so forcefully that the door swung open and smacked into the wall, waking up Kikuka Sijiro. "What is it?" The leader of the Sword Art Online Case Victims Rescue Force smoothed the wrinkles in his suit, not quite happy with how abrupt his awakening had been, or that it had happened at all, really. The number of deceased SAO players had just reached 2,000, and his team had yet to make any progress in cracking Kaiba's system and freeing the victims. He was under a lot of pressure, and hadn't slept well in days, as it was proved by him dozing off in his office. "I'm sorry, sir, but you need to see this." Something about the way his subordinate was behaving told him this was serious, however. The way the man's eyes were bulging, and the urgency in his voice worried Kikuka. He grabbed the tablet the man offered him, and frowned. He didn't quite comprehend what he was seeing. "What am I looking at?" It's a live stream of the SAO players battling against the first-floor boss of Aincrad." Kikuka almost dropped the tablet. "Those are SAO players. And this monster. They are going to fight it." His subordinate gulped and then nodded. Kikuka watched for a few more seconds as the monster, which appeared to be called Ilfang something, growled. A few of the players stepped back, fear and apprehension clear on their faces, but none ran away. "How did you get this? Did we finally manage to get inside the Cardinal system?" And no. Not exactly. His gaze shot to the man, who was looking incredibly uncomfortable and ashamed. "Then how?" Once again, his subordinate gulped, his forehead covered in sweat. He turned on Kikuka's computer and put it on a video streaming website. Then, he tuned the television in the corner to a news channel. By now, Kikuka had a very bad feeling, which only got worse as he watched the very same video playing on the tablet in his hands, being shown in the other two electronics. "Sir. It's everywhere, not just in Japan, but all around the world. Thousands and then millions of people stopped what they were doing to watch as 4 dozen people battled for survival." Many didn't understand what they were seeing at first, but those who had heard of the SAO incident were quick to realize and share the news. For the second time in a little more than a month, the world was shaken. When news were first released that some madman had trapped 10,000 souls inside a death game, many didn't believe it. But as more and more players died, the rest didn't wake up, and news organizations around the world reported it, everyone realized it was real. When nothing else but deaths happened in the following month, most people, especially those from other countries, quickly classed it as another tragic incident and forgot about it. But now, the world watched in trepidation as players risked their lives, almost as if they were gladiators in ancient times. Governments tried and failed miserably to contain the news. As soon as they took one video streaming website down, another 10 popped up. Eventually, they gave up. It was very obvious that Kaiba wanted the world to watch, and he would make sure that happened. To someone who could hold 10,000 people hostage in a video game, it wasn't that surprising that he also could hack his way into getting what he wanted. But Drifter had no idea any of this was happening. He didn't even know the other players were watching, much less the real world. And even if he did, he wouldn't care right now. Not when a 4 meters tall monster with a gigantic axe was roaring at him. Drifter had fought wolves and boars, and even fish before, which didn't sound all that impressive, but one had to remember that those same mobs had killed hundreds of players. He also had a great deal of experience with ruined kobolds, so he thought that their lord wouldn't be much different. Stronger, scarier, and much more deadly, sure. But at least similar. This was not what he was seeing in front of him. What he saw was a true monster. Ilfang had blood-red fur and cruel eyes, red too. When he snarled, saliva flew everywhere. At the same time, 3 ruined kobold sentinels spawned. They were a lot different than the other labyrinth mobs, using some kind of plate armor that covered their entire body and heads. Each of them was using a mace that looked more like a huge boulder on a stick. No doubt they could crack open someone's head with a single swing. Diavel trained his sword on the boss, and yelled a command. Drawing courage from who knows where, the raid party, Drifter included, shouted and charged forward to meet their enemies. While Diavel and 3 of the smaller parties they were split into fought Ilfang, Drifter faced one of the add-ons the boss had spawned. As they discussed before, Nautilus was the first to clash against the mob. Knowing he had a shorter reach and as such wouldn't be able to land the first blow, the ash-haired player raised his shield and braced for impact. The force behind the hit still sent him stumbling a few steps back, and took a few percents off of his health bar. Ugh. Be careful, they hit hard. Without needing prompting, Yuna started playing Rest. Meanwhile, Kirito jumped forward and struck the mob with a horizontal square. Switch. Drifter. The spearman advanced, spearhead snaking forward, aiming for the opening on the helmet, but the ruined kobold sentinel moved its head, and Drifter's weapon hit cold metal, before deflecting harmlessly to the side. Muttering a curse under his breath, he decided to be less ambitious with his next strike, and targeted the uncovered forearm of the creature, this time being rewarded with a growl of pain. Switch. Stepping to the side to dodge an overhead blow from the mace, Drifter called for a switch, and realized his mistake only when Nautilus and Asuna advanced at the same time, saw each other going for it, and hesitated. Drifter had grown used to being in a party with just Yuna and Nautilus, so only the blade user could switch with him. Now that there were others in the party, he forgot to specify who he was calling, hence the confusion. His mistake was punished quite quickly and brutally by the ruined kobold sentinel. Drifter only had time to shift his body a little to try and cushion the blow before he was sent rolling back by a mace crushing down on his side. Drifter. I'm okay. Quickly jumping to his feet, he checked that his health had dropped to the upper range of yellow. It was quite a bit of damage, but not enough he would be in a life-threatening situation. Looking up, Drifter saw that Nautilus had already gotten hold of the mob's aggro, and was working with Kirito to force it back. A well-placed throwing pick from Sinan nailed the kobold right in the face, through the opening Drifter had failed to hit before. He couldn't help but give her a thumbs up. Great aim. Thanks. You good? Yeah. I was dumb, sorry about that. Later, Drifter. Focus. Despite their situation, Drifter couldn't help but chuckle when Yuna chided him, especially when the songstress had basically forced a health potion down his throat. Still, he rejoined the fight without hesitation. Aim for the neck. There's space between its helmet and chest armor. Kirito put his words into action as he performed a sting, stabbing his one-handed sword deep into said opening, and scoring a critical hit. With a flurry of quick hits from Asuna, the ruined kobold sentinel burst into polygons. Taking the opportunity while there were no more ads being spawned, the party stopped to catch their breath. Drifter briefly watched the others fighting the boss, and, while he wished he could go help, he knew it was better to stick to the plan. At least everything seemed to be going well. Diavel was rotating the party's tanking Ilfang the Kobold Lord in such a way that the moment somebody's health dropped, they were substituted. Happy that everything was okay, Drifter turned to his own party to apologize. Sorry, I screwed up. It's okay, nothing bad happened. Yeah, don't beat yourself over yet. I won't. Won't happen again either. Teams F and G, switch in. Team H, there are more mobs spawning, take care of them. Roger. Diavel briefly turned to bark orders at them, and Kirito shouted their acknowledgement. The blue-haired man had been doing a stellar job in leading the battle until now, but the pressure on him was a lot. Yuna gave Drifter's hand a quick squeeze, and he flashed her and Nautilus a smile before he rejoined the battle with the others. This time, he was much more careful when calling out the switches. Last HP bar. Keep it up. As Ilfang the Kobold Lord went down to its fourth and last health bar, a new group of ruined kobold sentinels spawned, which were quickly split amongst the support groups, and taken care of. Then, Ilfang's health reached red, and the monster roared before throwing his axe and shield away. Now, he was going to use his Talwar. Drifter frowned when he saw the long blade the boss had pulled out. It didn't look like the drawings he had seen in the guidebook. Maybe Argo remembered the appearance of the weapon wrongly. That didn't sound like her, to be honest. As Diavel yelled for the others to stay back, and he charged to deal the last blow, ignoring the plan he himself had drafted, it must be said, Drifter caught a glimpse of Kirito's horrified expression, and suddenly his worst suspicion came through. He was moving even before the swordsman screamed warning cut the air. It's no good. Jump back as fast as you can. That's not a Talwar, it's a Nodachi. Chapter 19, clearing the first floor and beater time seemed to slow down. At least that was how Drifter felt when he ran towards Diavel, only to witness their leader being hit by a brutal combo skill from Ilfang the Kobold Lord, for which he wasn't prepared for, and that left him no time to put up a defense. Diavel. The first blow sent the shield bearer high into the air, while the second and third sent him back to the ground like a cannonball. Drifter winced, knowing the chances of Diavel surviving a sequence of attacks like that were low. Kirito, having started to move just a fraction of a second later than him, ran towards the blue-haired player. Drifter didn't. Instead, he rushed to intercept the boss. The raid party had planned and prepared to face an Ilfang armed with a Talwar, with a shorter reach and a completely different set of skills. Not this monster with the vicious-looking long sword Kirito called a Nodachi. They had already witnessed it in use, and it hit fast and hard. Drifter knew that if he allowed the boss to let loose amidst the other players, who were still stunned from watching Diavel being so easily dispatched, it would be a massacre. Of course, Drifter wasn't any more prepared than them to face the boss. He also had no idea of what attack patterns and skills Ilfang the Kobold Lord had now, and could very possibly be running to his death. But he had to do something. And something he did. It was stupid, perhaps, but Drifter surged forward with a rage spike, the tip of his weapon slamming against the side of Ilfang's blade, and pushing it away from the players it was about to cut down. The Nodachi slammed into the ground, carving a deep gorge, but thankfully missing anyone. Unfortunately, while Drifter had very possibly just saved a couple lives, his actions also caused the boss to turn its attention to him. Ilfang's aggro system was much more developed than that of normal mobs, after all. Drifter's eyes widened when he saw the cruel red eyes focus on him, as the boss pulled its lips back in a snarl that showed all his sharp teeth. Crap. You never realized how badly you had screwed up until after the fact. Hindsight was really an amazing thing. For example, now Drifter was considering that maybe charging at the bloodthirsty boss was not the best decision. Luckily, there were others who had just as little common sense as him. Drifter, switch. His body moved before his mind could process what was happening, and Drifter stepped back and watched as Nautilus collided with Ilfang the Kobold Lord, blade sinking deep into the kobold's flank. Ilfang roared in anger, but all he received as answer was one of Sinan's throwing picks embedded in his left eye. Rarg. The boss went berserk after the last hit. With a swipe of its tail, all nearby players were sent flying, Drifter included. The damage wasn't much, but it was more than enough to force them all away. All except one. Ilfang the Kobold Lord had turned around when Sinan injured it, and, as such, Nautilus was on the blind spot of its following attack. Now, the blade user was alone against the boss. Not. Two identical cries cut the air as both Yuna and Drifter watched in horror. Their friend seemed to be frozen in fear, and didn't make any move to dodge or block the incoming sword's skill. Drifter caught a glimpse of Nautilus' face, and saw the despair and unwillingness in his eyes. Unfortunately, he was too late. Just as the Ilfang was about to hit Nautilus much in the same way he had done to Diavel, a black-haired figure intercepted the attack with a sword skill of his own. The two weapons collided and recoiled from the impact, as did their wielders. Switch. Even as he stumbled back, Kirito yelled a command. Asuna must have been moving even before Kirito spoke, because she reached Ilfang in a flash. Her rapier glowed and she stabbed the boss multiple times, so fast Drifter had a hard time catching a glimpse of the thin blade. While all of this was happening, Drifter couldn't help but look to the spot where Diavel had fallen, and Kirito had been assisting him moments earlier. To his despair, there was no sign of their raid party leader other than a few sparkles quickly vanishing in the air. Forcing back a choking scream of both sadness and rage, Drifter rushed to aid his friends. There would be time to mourn later. Now, they had to make sure Diavel was the only casualty of the battle. An attack from Ilfang the Kobold Lord glanced Kirito's torso, and the boy tumbled back, bringing Asuna, who had been preparing for another switch, down with him. Drifter would have suffered a similar fate if not for a giant double-bladed axe suddenly getting in the way. He looked up to see Agile, who had a grim smile on his face as he stared at the monster. "You won't get another one, fucker." With a growl comparable to the ones the boss had been uttering, the merchant forced the boss back. Nautilus, who seemed to have finally regained control of his limbs, came to their assistance, and, together, the trio of Drifter, Nautilus, and Agile, with a remarkable amount of ranged support from Sinan, held back the boss while Kirito and Asuna recovered. But it wasn't easy. The new attack patterns Ilfang the Kobold Lord was using were unlike anything they had seen and prepared for before. Suddenly, Drifter had an epiphany. There was someone amongst them who had witnessed a Nodachi in use. He exchanged a quick glance with Agile, knowing the merchant to be quick on the uptake. He wasn't disappointed. While Drifter and Nautilus did their best to deflect and block the boss offensive, Agile spun around to face the young swordsman. "We'll hold him off till you recover." Kirito nodded, and quickly drank a health potion before turning to discuss something with Asuna. Drifter really wasn't paying attention to that, as he was occupied trying not to die. After dodging a particularly vicious attack from Ilfang the Kobold Lord, he glared at Kibu and the other players, who were still stunned by Diavel's death. "What the hell are you waiting for?" That seemed to snap them out of their grief-induced trance. Yelling, they surged forth with a vengeance, intent on bringing down the boss. Their newfound vigor lasted about 5 seconds, which was the time Ilfang's AI took to decide it didn't want to be surrounded. The boss suddenly jumped up and towards a column, then used it as a platform to launch itself towards Drifter and Agile, who seemed to hold most of its aggro. And, for the second time in the battle, a black-haired swordsman intercepted the boss. Kirito seemed to have used a sword skill to catapult himself through the air and towards Ilfang the Kobold Lord, something which Drifter would have to try later. The result was both player and boss stopping mid-air and then falling to the ground. Switch. Already in position, Asuna promptly obeyed the command, and, with uncanny coordination, beat back Ilfang just enough that Kirito's next skill, a simple vertical, slipped right through the boss guard, stabbing deep into his gut, then tearing a red line upwards, almost separating the monster's right arm from its body. With a cheerful noise, Ilfang the Kobold Lord shattered. Af. Af. Kirito went down on one knee, sword still gripped tightly in his fingers. For a moment, his labored breath was all that could be heard in the boss room, before someone finally broke in cheer. We won. Whoa. While others jumped and hugged in celebration, Drifter sat down, panting. He was feeling just as euphoric as everyone else for finally taking the first step towards escaping SAO, but he had been the one to take on the brunt of Ilfang's last berserk rampage. How are you feeling? Well, not just him. Nautilus and Agile collapsed next to Drifter, feeling just as tired. The three of them had to hold back the boss by themselves, and apart from the ash-haired blade user, none of them were equipped for it. Battered. Ha. You tell me. The merchant snorted, and patted Drifter's back. He felt another, much softer hand gently squeeze his shoulder, and flashed a smile at Yuna, who had joined them. She looked happy, but there was still some lingering tension in her face. Hey, Yun. How are you doing? Fine. I'm more worried about. The songstress didn't complete her sentence, her voice a whisper so quiet only Drifter could hear it. Following her gaze, he saw Nautilus holding his knees to his chest, and staring at nothing. Frowning, Drifter thought back to the fight. The way Nautilus froze had been rather strange. And, from the looks of it, Yuna knew what this was about. But they could discuss this later, when it was just the three of them. Now, what they should do was make sure he wasn't beating himself over it. Nautilus, are you? Why? The sharp question interrupted anything Drifter wanted to say. He turned and saw Kibu kneeling, his fists clenched. Around him, his party members were, very uncharacteristically, not celebrating their victory. Instead, they seemed angry. Why? Why did you let Diavel die? The question was directed at Kirito, who was still in the same spot. Slowly, the players who had come over to congratulate him stepped back, leaving a clear line of sight between him and Kibu. You knew the boss moves. If you shared what you knew beforehand, he wouldn't have died. There were tears in Kibu's eyes, but at the moment Drifter couldn't bring himself to feel pity. All he could think was, "Are you stupid?" Sanan's voice was so harsh that even Drifter winced. She had her arms crossed in front of her chest, and was looking at Kibu as if he was an idiot. You. What? Do you think Kirito wanted Diavel to die? We all read the guidebook, it clearly said Ilfang would use a Talwar. No one could have known Kayaba would make changes to the boss. Kibu flinched away from Sanan's piercing gaze, and Drifter didn't blame him. It was always the quiet ones who were scarier. But his party members weren't going to stay quiet. One of them pointed to Kirito accusingly. He must be a beta tester. That's how he knew all the boss attack patterns. He knew, but didn't tell us. There must be other beta testers here too, right? That player simply ignored whatever Sanan had said, and, to Drifter's horror, other players soon started echoing his words. Suspicious glances were thrown around, and he could foresee the raid party falling apart right there and then. But there was one more urgent worry. Motioning for Yuna and Nautilus to follow him, he went to stand next to Kirito, Sanan, and a pretty chestnut-haired girl he had never seen before. Asuna was nowhere to be seen, though she was still in their party, so she must be alive. Oh. It took him a few seconds to make the connection, and realize said new girl was Asuna. Her hood must have broken during the battle, or she unequipped it. Drifter, this ain't looking good. No, it isn't. Maybe Drifter shouldn't be surprised that Agile had followed him, the much larger man now standing in front of Kirito. They both understood that whether Kirito was a beta tester or not didn't matter anymore. The other players seemed ready for a public lynching. Ha 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 ha. Ha ha ha. The spearman was still trying to find a way to defuse the situation when cold, bitter laughter cut off his train of thought. He spun around, and saw Kirito getting up with a disdainful expression that would have made Drifter want to punch him if it weren't for how obviously fake and forced it was from up close. A beta tester. Pfft. I wish you wouldn't compare me to those newbies. As he spoke, Kirito pushed past Asuna and Sinon, but both girls were too stunned by his sudden change to react. With unhurried steps, the young swordsman made his way towards the set of stairs that had appeared after they defeated Ilfang the Kobold Lord. What? Most of the 1,000 beta testers were beginners who didn't even know how to level up. You guys are better than they are. But I'm not like them. I made it higher than anyone during the beta test. Kirito stopped and put a hand on his hips. The reason I knew the boss skills is because I fought monsters with katana skills on floors far above us. I know a lot more. Way more than any information broker. The boy scanned the crowd with a despising gaze, oozing superiority. Drifter didn't believe it even for a second. But others did. That's even worse than a beta tester. You are cheating. A cheater. Parroting Kibu's words, the players who had been moments later praising Kirito for his masterful display of sword skills, now cursed him. Hey! That's not. Drifter stopped Asuna by holding her shoulder, and Nautilus did the same with Yuna, both girls having been about to jump out to defend their party member. They glared at the boys, but Drifter shook his head surreptitiously. Let him. This is not something we can stop now. We will talk later. He added that last sentence to avoid misunderstandings. Drifter and Agile, being slightly older and having more real-life experience, had some idea of the play Kirito was putting on. And, as much as they hated to admit it, it was the best option. Not the most correct or fair, but the best nonetheless. A beta tester and a cheater. He is a beater. Drifter didn't know who was the first to come up with the play of words, but it caught on fast. Soon, most of the players were yelling it in accusing tones. But of course, Kirito was not done yet. With a few quick taps on his menu, a black coat draped itself over his shoulders. A beater. I like it. That's right, I am a beater. From now on, don't confuse me with other testers. Heh. His coat fluttering to some unseen wind, Kirito pushed open the doors leading to the second floor, and stepped through. At the same moment, Drifter, Yuna, Nautilus, Sinon, and Asuna received a notification telling them that he had left the party. Chapter 20, Not alone with narrowed eyes, Drifter stared at Kirito's departing figure. Then, he turned to Asuna, who was glaring daggers at him. How was a 14 or 15 years old girl so scary? Explain. Not here. It would ruin everything Kirito has done. Come on, we should catch up to him. He tried to impart as much calmness as he could, lest the girl started arguing right here in the middle of the boss room. Thankfully, Asuna gave him the benefit of the doubt, and nodded curtly. Drifter scanned his gaze over the other members of the raid party. Most were still shell-shocked, but Kibu's face was turning shades the spearman had never seen before, which could only mean he was about to blow up. Agile. I know, go on. I will try to calm the nerves down here, although I doubt it will work. It should give you enough time to explain things to them and get to him, though. Thanks, man. No problems, tell the little guy he is still welcome in my shop. Will do. Smiling, Drifter gestured for his party to come with him. While Kirito had taken control during the fight, and it was a good thing he did, otherwise more people would have died, it seemed command had fallen back into his hands once they were in the clear. He quite liked this arrangement. Directing a battle was stressful. With large strides, the group of 5 left the boss room, and climbed the somber set of stairs that led to the second floor. Before Asuna could open her mouth to demand answers again, Drifter started speaking. Let's talk while we walk. I would hate to lose Kirito now because we were too slow. Just behind him, Asuna huffed in agreement. Drifter could see that Nautilus was still somewhat confused, while Yuna, after the adrenaline settled down, had a thoughtful expression that led him to believe she already suspected what Kirito's reasons for acting the way he did were. As for Sinon, she had yet to speak after her little outburst back in Ilfang's chambers. The girl struck Drifter as the calm and calculating sort since the first meeting, so she probably wasn't too far behind Drifter's and Agile's train of thought. What Kirito just did was prevent a witch hunt from starting, Asuna. And quite possibly he just saved a whole bunch of lives. What do you mean? What witch hunt? Against beta testers. Of course. Sinon slapped her forehead and scowled. Drifter wasn't sure if she was angry at herself for not noticing earlier, or at Kirito. Either way, he nodded, and continued. That's right. Thanks to all that bullshit Kibu was spouting, we were about to tear ourselves from the inside. People would start looking at their own party members, their friends, and wonder if they were beta testers waiting to rob them of all their spoils and hard work. The way that stupid Cactus Head was speaking, it even sounded like beta testers would let other players die on purpose. Or even worse. The others quickly caught on to what Drifter and Sinon were implying. None of them were dumb, after all. Yeah, I don't even want to think about it from that angle. Anyway, Kirito, who certainly is a beta tester by the way, understood that. And he knew that if it was allowed to continue, we would never clear this damn game. Not if we couldn't trust the people we were fighting with. Once again, Drifter felt the urge to curse and give Kibu a good beating. While it was understandable that the player was angry and grieving Diavel's death, his accusations had almost destroyed everything their blue-haired leader had worked so hard for. No, they would have done so if Kirito hadn't decided to take the burden on himself. Kirito noticed all that. He played the part of the big bad wolf, the villain. Now, whenever someone thinks of beta testers, they will only think of him. The beater. Curse the idiot who came up with that name. It's gonna catch on. But. That's so unfair. The spearman let out a dry chuckle at Asuna's argument. It is. And as much as I hate to admit it, it was probably the only way to cease the infighting before it even started. At least I couldn't think of any better ideas in the heat of the moment. People are gonna hate Kirito because of this. He sacrificed himself to give everyone else a better chance. Nautilus held Yuna in a one-armed hug before letting go. The songstress, always so emphatic, had moist eyes. Fortunately, it wasn't that bad yet. At least, Drifter hopped not. That was his intention, certainly. But not everyone is as much of an idiot as Kibu. If we in Agile could arrive at that conclusion within a few seconds, then most players will too, after they get over the initial period of anger. Remind me to send Argo a message explaining everything later. Or, better yet, we should set up a meeting with her. Let her spread the word about what truly happened before Cactusman starts babbling his hate speech to anyone who will listen. Even then, people still won't trust Kirito. He will become a loner. A pariah. Stopping, Drifter turned around and held Sinan's shoulder. He grimaced, but quickly hid it behind a serious expression as he looked at the party. Not if we have something to say about it. Kikuka was out the door and rushing towards the parking lot before the live stream even cut off. Find out who that Kirito is immediately. Already did, so we cross-referenced his face with the most active victims during the boss fight. Here. Kikuka grabbed the tablet his subordinate handed him, showing a teenager boy's face, with messy black hair and black eyes. He quickly scanned the file while getting in the back seat of his car. Kirigaya Kazuto. 14, deceased parents, lives with his aunt, uncle, and cousin. Hacked a government database to find out who his parents were when he was 10. Raising an eyebrow, Kikuka quickly reread that last line. He wasn't sure if he should be feeling as impressed as he was considering what the boy did was illegal, but then again, he had been just a kid. It wasn't important now. Naguka-kun, please call the boy's family, and tell them to meet us at the hospital as quickly as they can, if they are not already on the way. Yes, sir, I need to. Shit, I left my phone in the office. Chi-chan, lend me ours. The driver nimbly pulled her phone out of her pocket, unlocked it, and threw the device to her boss. On the passenger seat, Naguka was hurriedly speaking with Kirito's family. From the snippets of conversation he overheard, they were already almost at the hospital Kirito was staying. Hello. Chi. It's me, Ogaka-san. Sir. You saw the SAO transmission, didn't you? Good, I need you to start working on two things. First, discover how the hell Kayaba did that, and why. Second, identify every player who was present at the boss fight, and draft a plan to move them to the 1st General Military Hospital. Yes, I know they aren't soldiers, I'm not stupid. But their faces just got stamped on every news channel and website in the world, and I very much doubt this was a one-time stunt from Kayaba. If they participate in a few more raids, they will soon reach the level of global celebrities. Yeah, I know. Just hold the sharks off while we try to make sense of this mess. I will give a statement later today. All right, I want all that information ready on my desk when I come back. By the time Kikuka had finished delivering his orders, they had reached the hospital. Taking a few moments to smooth his clothes and hair, the men walked to the room where Kirigaya Kazuto was hospitalized, and knocked. He wasn't sure if someone would answer, but it appeared the Kirigayas had arrived even faster than him. A 13 or 14-year-old girl with black hair and bangs opened the door. Her eyes were puffy and red, making it very clear that she had been crying. Yes. Good afternoon. You must be Kirigaya Suguha, right? Can I come in? I must speak to your parents. Mr. Seijiru, is that you? Let him in, dear. The teen stepped aside to let him in, before returning to her spot next to the young boy in the hospital bed. Kikuka couldn't see his face because of the nerve gear, but he didn't need to. Practically the entire world knew it. Miss and Mr. Kirigaya, thank you for allowing me in. I'm sure you all watched the live stream. Hard not to. Kirito's, no, Kazuto's uncle and adoptive father, Kirigaya Mintaka, snorted. Kikuka couldn't help but chuckle along, though neither of the women in the room seemed amused. Kirigaya Midori got up to greet him. Mr. Seijiru. What the hell happened? The woman yelled into his face with an intensity that only a mother worrying about her son could. It reminded Kikuka of why he never married. Miss Kirigaya, I am ashamed to say that we are still as lost as you. As much as it pains me to admit, Akihiko Kaiba is a genius. My team is still trying to decipher the hows and whys. But that's not the main reason I am here. It concerns Kazuto's unique situation. You mean that beater thing? My Kazuto is not a cheater. He would never have let that man die on purpose. Kikuka raised his hands in surrender and in an attempt to pacify the woman. He had met Kirigaya Midori before, and knew she didn't behave this panicky usually. But she had just watched her adoptive son essentially turn himself into the enemy of all the remaining 8.000 SAO players, so her distress was understandable. I understand, and I fully believe you, Ms. Kirigaya. This is the first time we managed to peek inside SAO, so I can't even begin to fathom the dynamics developed between the players during this last month. If I were to wager a guess, however, I would say your son just stopped them from falling apart. You should be proud. The Kirigaya family relaxed as one. They were probably worried about Kikula believing the whole beater thing and charging Kazuto with something. That was obviously not going to happen, but watching someone you deeply cared about fight to the death with a giant monster, and then get shunned but his peers didn't do wonders for your mental state. On that note, I need your authorization to move Kazuto to a more secure facility. What? Why? Just because we understand Kazuto has done nothing wrong, and even saved the lives of many in the raid party, doesn't mean everyone else does too, Mr. Kirigaya. Especially family members of deceased SAO victims. They will be grieving and in pain, and not thinking straight. I don't want to risk any accidents. It took a moment for his words to sink in, and when they did, the family quickly agreed to his suggestion. Kikuka didn't stay for long. There was a lot to be done today, and many problems to be solved. Before leaving, however, he patted the young child Suguha on the shoulder. Don't worry, your brother will be fine. It may look like he left everyone behind, but he is not alone. And he is strong. You will see him again soon. The second floor of Aincrad was nothing like Drifter imagined. For some reason, namely logic, which obviously didn't apply to a video game, he thought it would be similar to the first floor, with grassy plains and forests. Instead, what he saw was a vast savanna with seemingly no end in sight. At the edge of his vision there was a city, which should be the equivalent of the town of beginnings. The impressive view was something to worry about later, though. Right now, Drifter and the rest of the party were more concerned with the young player slowly walking towards the city, lost in his thoughts. Kirito only noticed them when Sinan punched his shoulder. Idiot. Dumb. Selfish. Ouch. Drifter snickered at Kirito's confused and somewhat hurt expression. When the boy turned to him, his mouth stretched into a grin. You deserve that, Kirito. I think I do. But why are you all here? Sinan, you can punch him again. The whole group, minus Kirito, laughed at what Nautilus said. Sinan did punch him again, very lightly. And, while Kirito was still befuddled, Asuna schooled her expression and stepped towards him, hands on hips. Her hazel eyes carried such an intensity that the boys took a few steps back, gulping. Kirito, Drifter explained why you did all that back in the boss room. We understand it now, but it doesn't mean we like it. I didn't want to drag you into the mess I made. And that's why I said you are being selfish. You literally saved our lives during the fight. Did you really think we would abandon you? Sorry. Taking the chance after the scolding was finished, Drifter sent a party invite to Kirito again. Furthermore, once the boy accepted, he made him into the party leader. To his questioning glance, he had a simple answer. You got us through Ilfang. I will feel a hell of a lot safer if it's you leading us. Not to mention, being just a party member is a lot less stressful. Good luck. After opening and closing his mouth a few times, and seeing the others not even trying to hide their laughter, Kirito gave up trying to argue he was a solo player. He still didn't believe he was fit to be a party leader, but honestly he was overwhelmed enough by the fact Drifter, Yuna, Nautilus, Sinan, and Asuna wanted him on their party that it kinda slipped his mind. All right, Kirito, as the only beta testers amongst us, what should we do now? Get to Urbis, that is, the main city of this floor, and activate the teleporter. It allows players to travel to the second floor from the first without having to go through the tower. That made sense. Without much ado, the now complete party marched towards the city before the rest of the raid group could catch up to them.